Denise Callahan set the cracked leather ledger on Ruth's lap like a paper plate at the end of a buffet and said, "You can keep this one, it's not worth anything." That's the line that started it. 9 days after the funeral, they took the house on Coldwater Creek Road. They took Walter's truck. They took $340,000 out of the joint accounts before the grass had even started on his grave. Denise already had $60,000 down on a lake house 2 counties over. Ruth Ann Callahan, 74 years old, stood in her own front hall with $47 in her coat pocket and a crying beagle at her feet, holding a piece of old scrap paper nobody in that room thought was worth a second look. She'd kept the books for a hardware store by hand for 40 years and never once been off by $1. Nobody thought to ask what else she might be good at counting. Nobody thought to open the ledger past the first page. Ruth didn't either. Not yet. None of that came first, though. First, there was a store on Depot Street, and a man who counted every nail in the bin twice before he trusted the number. Denise Callahan set the cracked leather ledger on Ruth's lap like a paper plate at the end of a buffet and said, "You can keep this one, it's not worth anything." The living room on Coldwater Creek Road was already half boxes. 2 men from Higgins Moving carried out the china cabinet Walter had built the year Gary was born, and nobody stopped them. Ruth sat on a folding chair somebody had set up near the window because the good chairs were already wrapped in blankets and loaded. "Denise," Ruth said, "that's your father-in-law's handwriting in there." "It's a bunch of old receipts, Ruth." Denise didn't look up from her clipboard. She had a clipboard for everything now. Nails, screws, some fishing line. "It's not going to appraise for anything." "I wasn't asking you to appraise it." Gary stood by the door in his good coat, the one he wore to church twice a year, turning his keys over in his hand. He hadn't said much all morning. He was 46 years old, and he still looked in that doorway like a boy waiting to be told he could go outside. "Mom, we're just trying to get this handled quick," he said, "for everybody's sake." "Handled quick," Ruth repeated, like she was tasting the words to see if they were true. Denise clicked her pen. "The estate has debts, Ruth. There's the funeral, there's back taxes on the store building, there's the truck loan that never got paid off. We're not being cruel, we're being responsible." She said responsible the way some women say a brand name, proud of how it sounded coming out of her mouth. You can't live in a house this size on a fixed income. It's not realistic. It's not, frankly, living within your means. Ruth looked past her, out the window, at the movers loading the porch swing onto a flatbed. "Walter built that swing the summer Gary broke his arm," she said, "so Gary'd have somewhere to sit still." Nobody answered that. Denise checked something off her clipboard. Duke, the old beagle, pressed himself against Ruth's ankle and let out a low whine, the kind that comes from a dog whose hips ache worse in the cold. Ruth reached down without looking, without breaking whatever thin thread of dignity she was holding onto in that room, and set her paper plate of chicken salad, the one thing the movers had let her keep on the counter for lunch, down on the floor in front of him. "Ruth, we don't have money for a vet on that dog much longer," Denise said. "I'm just saying it plain. It's 14 years old. Maybe it's a mercy to think about that too." "He's 13, Ruth said, "and he's not going anywhere either." She watched Duke eat off her own lunch plate, patient, while the men carried her wedding china past her in a box marked "Kitchen, Misk" in Denise's handwriting. 43 years of marriage filed under Misk. When the last box went out the door, Ruth found a pen in her purse and a torn envelope, and she wrote on the back of it in the same careful cursive she'd used for 40 years of ledgers and Christmas cards. "Thank you for your care with Walter's things. It means more than you know." She signed it Ruth Callahan and handed it to the younger of the 2 movers, a boy who couldn't have been older than 22, who looked like he didn't quite know what to do with a woman thanking him on the day she was losing everything. "You didn't have to do that, ma'am," he said. "I know," Ruth said. "I wanted to." Denise was already at the car, on the phone with someone about paint colors for the lake house. Gary lingered a second longer. "Mom, the cottage behind the church is ready. Pastor Whitfield said you can move in whenever. I know where it is, Gary. I used to walk your father's dog around it every Sunday for 30 years before you were born." He flinched a little at that, like it landed somewhere he wasn't expecting. Then he went and got in the car next to his wife, and the car pulled out of the driveway of the house Ruth had lived in since Nixon was president. And that was that. She stood a minute in the empty yard with the ledger under her arm, and Duke leaning against her leg, and she did not cry, because there had been a lot of crying already in 6 weeks, and her body seemed to have decided it was done for the day. She looked at the ledger, cracked leather, corners worn soft as cloth, Walter's handwriting bleeding through the cover from the first page. Nobody had thought to open it past page 1. Nobody had thought there was anything in Ruth's hands worth looking at twice. That was the mistake, sitting quiet in her arms the whole time the boxes went out the door, and it would take Ruth herself a little while yet to understand what she was carrying. The cottage behind the First Baptist Church on Main was small and square and smelled like cedar and old dog. Everybody in Briar Hollow still called it the dog-walking cottage, on account of the shelter using it 40 years back to house strays waiting on families. It had 1 bedroom, a kitchen the size of a closet, and a window that looked out on the churchyard where Walter was buried under 6 weeks of new grass. Pastor Whitfield had left the porch light on for her. Ruth noticed that before she noticed anything else. Somebody had thought to leave a light on. She fed Duke, got him settled on a folded quilt by the radiator, and sat down at the little kitchen table with the ledger in front of her, because it was the only thing left in the world that still had Walter's hand in it, and she wasn't ready to put it down yet. She opened the cover. First page, faded blue ink, the handwriting she'd know if it was carved into a rock 100 years from now. Count every page, Ruthie. The last one's worth more than the rest. She read it twice. She didn't know what it meant. It read like something Walter might have written half joking, some private note between them from 30 years back about the store's slow months, the kind of thing he used to scrawl at the bottom of a bad quarter to keep her spirits up. She'd forgotten most of his little jokes by now. Grief did that. It took the funny things first. She turned a few more pages out of habit, the way you flip through a photo album you've seen 100 times, not looking for anything, just wanting the shape of him under her thumb. Columns of numbers in his neat hand. Nails, sold. Fencing wire, ordered. And here and there in the margins, notes that didn't seem to belong to any hardware order at all. Box 114, ask for Pruitt, a date from 1971 next to a name she didn't recognize. Corbett. She didn't know what any of it meant. She was tired, and her hip ached from the folding chair, and Duke was already snoring against the radiator like nothing in the world had changed. She closed the ledger, set it on the table by the door where she'd see it first thing, and turned off the lamp. The porch light stayed on all night. She'd asked Pastor Whitfield to leave it that way. Some nights, that was as much comfort as a woman could ask for. Ruth woke at 6 the way she had for 40 years. Before the alarm, before the sun, her body still keeping Walter's old store hours out of habit. She lay still a minute in the strange bed, listening for a truck that wasn't coming down Depot Street anymore, and then she got up and put the coffee on. Duke didn't jump up from the radiator quite as fast as he used to. She poured his kibble and stood over him a second, checking the stiffness in his back legs the way she used to check inventory, top to bottom. Nothing skipped. "You're stiffer than yesterday," she told him. "We'll manage." Her widow's check came to $212 a month. She'd already done the arithmetic 3 times on the back of a grocery receipt. Rent on the cottage was covered by the church, but food wasn't, and Duke's arthritis pills weren't, and she had exactly $111 left after the funeral home took its final payment. She wasn't complaining about it. She was just counting it. Counting was the one thing nobody could take out of her hands. She was at the little table doing just that, pencil against paper, when a knock came at the door around 6 in the evening, careful and light, like whoever it was expected to be turned away. It was Earl Pruitt. Ruth hadn't seen him since the funeral, where he'd stood at the back in a gray suit and hadn't said much, just shook her hand too long and looked at the floor. Mrs. Callahan. He held his hat against his chest like it was still 1968. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Earl Pruitt, you haven't intruded on anything since you were 19 years old and dropped a crate of nails on your own foot in front of my husband." That got a laugh out of him, short and surprised, like he hadn't planned on laughing today. "Boss never let me live that down," he said. "He called you that for 40 years. I never once heard him call you Earl." "No, ma'am. I don't think he ever did." He shifted his hat again. "I heard you'd moved into the cottage behind the church. Didn't feel right. You settling into a new place and nobody from the bank stopping by to see how you were getting on. You didn't have to. I know. I wanted to. Ruth almost smiled at that, hearing her own words come back to her in a different mouth. She let him in, put the coffee on again, and Duke came over and put his head on Pruitt's knee like he remembered him too, which he probably did. 40 years of a boy sweeping floors at Callahan's hardware leaves a scent a dog doesn't forget. "How's the bank treating you these days?" Ruth asked. "Vice president now, I heard. Vice president of loans and deposits, whatever that means. Mostly I sign things boss taught me never to sign without reading twice." He looked around the small kitchen. This is a fine little place. Quiet. It's what's left. He didn't ask her to explain that. He just nodded, like a man who already knew more than he was saying, which in a town the size of Briar Hollow he probably did. The ledger was sitting on the table where she'd left it, cover worn soft, corner curling up like an old shoe. Pruitt's eyes went to it and stayed there. "Is that his book? The one he kept behind the counter? Denise gave it to me, said it wasn't worth anything." Ruth set 2 cups down. Everything else she found a use for. This she handed to me like a paper plate. Pruitt reached out, not touching it yet, just hovering his hand over the cover the way you do near something that might still be warm. "May I?" It was his. I don't see why not. He opened it with more care than Denise had shown it in a week of packing boxes. He read the first page, the faded blue ink, and something crossed his face Ruth hadn't seen on anybody in a long while. Recognition. Like he'd heard a voice he thought was gone for good. "Count every page, Ruthie," he read out loud. "The last one's worth more than the rest." "I've read that line a dozen times," Ruth said. "I don't know what it means." "I thought it was one of his jokes." "Boss didn't joke about pages," Pruitt said quietly. "He counted twice before he trusted a number. You know that better than anybody." He turned through the middle pages slow, the way Ruth had the night before, nails and fencing wire and dates in Walter's careful hand, and then he stopped on the margin note she'd puzzled over. "Box 114, he read. "Ask for Pruitt." He looked up at her. "That's my box number, at the bank. I mean, that's a box we keep at First Farmers." Ruth's hand went still around her coffee cup. "He wrote your name in there." "When?" Pruitt flipped back to check a date near the note. 1971. "That's before you'd have had any authority to hand out a thing like that." "I was sweeping floors in 71, Mrs. Callahan. I didn't start at the bank till 83. They looked at each other a second, both turning that over, neither one saying yet what it might mean, because it didn't mean anything solid, not yet. Just a name and a number sitting in an old man's careful hand 12 years before it made any sense at all. "Turn the back cover," Ruth said, because something in her, the same something that never let a column go uncounted, told her the story wasn't finished on the last written page. Pruitt turned it over. The leather on the inside of the back cover had a seam running along the edge that didn't sit flush the way the front one did. He ran his thumb along it. "Ruth, this panel's loose. Let me see." She took the ledger from him, set it flat on the table under the kitchen lamp, and worked her fingernail under the edge of the leather. It gave, just a little, like it had been lifted before and glued back down light on purpose. "Careful," Pruitt said, leaning in. The leather peeled back with a small dry sound, and underneath it lay a folded square of paper, yellowed at the creases, thin as onion skin. Ruth's hands weren't as steady as she wanted them to be. She unfolded it anyway. It was a deposit slip. First Farmers Trust, dated 1971, Walter Callahan's signature at the bottom, in the same hand as the front page. And folded inside the slip, small enough that it nearly slid out onto the table before she caught it, was a brass key. Nobody said anything for a second. Duke's tail thumped once against the floor, like even he understood the room had changed shape. "That's a safe deposit key," Pruitt said. "I'd know that cut anywhere. We still use boxes from that same batch." "Box 114, Ruth said. "Box 114. She sat back in her chair and looked at the key sitting in her palm, small and ordinary and heavier somehow than anything Denise had carried out of that house in a box marked M.I.S.C. Earl. What would a man put in a box like that in 1971 and never tell his wife about? Pruitt didn't answer right away. He was still looking at the note in the margin, the date, the fact that he himself had been named in it 13 years before it made sense. like Walter had known something about the shape of the future that nobody else in the room could account for. "I don't know," he said finally. "But Boss didn't do anything without a reason. Not once in the whole time I knew him. He never mentioned Corbett to you? There's a name written by that same date." Corbett. Pruitt's face changed again, slower this time, like a man reaching for a memory he hadn't touched in years. "Corbett Mining," he said. "There used to be an office 2 doors down from the store. Shut down sometime in the 70s when the coal business went sideways around here." He shook his head. "I couldn't tell you more than that. I was a kid sweeping floors. Then we don't know anything yet." "No, ma'am, we don't." Ruth folded the deposit slip back around the key, the way she'd have wrapped a coin she wasn't ready to spend, and set it careful on the table. "I want to take this to the bank," she said. "Tomorrow, if you can spare the time, I can spare the time. But Ruth—" Pruitt hesitated, turning his hat in his hands again. "A box like that, registered under Walter's name alone? The bank's going to want paperwork before we open it. Death certificate. Something showing you're the one with the right to act on his estate." "I don't have any of that anymore," Ruth said. "Denise took every paper out of that house before she took the furniture, even the ones that were mine to keep. Then we'll need a certified copy. County clerk's office keeps one on file. Costs about $8, I believe, for a fresh copy." $8 I can manage," Ruth said, and for the first time since the funeral, there was something almost steady in her voice, something that sounded, if you didn't know better, close to purpose. "I've managed worse math than that." Pruitt smiled at her the way a much younger man might smile at somebody who taught him how to add. "Boss used to say the same thing," he said, word for word. Ruth looked down at the ledger, at the loose panel hanging open like a small door somebody had forgotten to shut for 50 years, and thought about Walter writing that first line in faded blue ink. Patient as a man planting something he wouldn't live to see grow. "Count every page," she said quietly. "He wasn't talking about the store at all, was he?" "I don't believe he was," Pruitt said. Outside, the porch light Pastor Whitfield had left burning buzzed faintly against the dark, and down the hill on Coldwater Creek Road, in a house that wasn't Ruth's anymore, a lamp was on in an upstairs window where Denise Callahan sat going over paint swatches for a lake house 2 counties over, certain that whatever mattered from that marriage had already been counted, weighed, and carried out the door. Ruth was up before 6 again, the way old habits refuse to die even when the life around them has. She dressed careful, a good blue cardigan, the one she'd worn to Walter's retirement dinner 20 years back, because a woman ought to look decent walking into a bank even if she's only got $103 left to her name. Pruitt picked her up at 8 sharp in a county car that still smelled like pine air freshener. "County clerk first," he said. "Then the bank." "You didn't have to drive me. I know. I wanted to." The clerk's office sat 2 blocks off the courthouse square, all fluorescent light and metal folding chairs. A woman behind the counter took Ruth's $8 and printed a certified copy of Walter's death certificate without once looking up from her screen. $8 for a piece of paper that said, in official ink, that the man Ruth had loved for 51 years no longer existed on paper. She folded it into her purse next to the deposit slip and the key. "Funny thing to have to buy," Ruth said, once they were back in the car. "Ma'am, proof he's gone. Feels like something I shouldn't need to pay for." Pruitt didn't answer that. Some things a man just lets sit. First Farmers Trust looked the same as it had for 40 years. Brick front, gold letters, a flag that needed replacing. Pruitt walked her past the tellers and back to a small room behind the vault door. A room with a table, 2 chairs, and a silence so complete Ruth could hear her own pulse in her ears. He signed a logbook, checked her death certificate against the account, checked her name against a signature card so old the ink had gone the color of weak tea. "Ruth Ellen Callahan," he read, "listed as co-signer on the box since 1971. I never signed anything in 1971. You did, you just didn't know what it was for." He pulled a long metal drawer from the wall, box 114, set it on the table between them, and looked at her. "You want to do the honors?" Ruth's hand wasn't steady. She put the brass key in anyway, turned it, and lifted the lid. Inside lay a stack of paper thinner than the ledger, tied with a faded rubber band gone brittle at the edges. On top, a stock certificate, gold script border, the kind of formal document nobody prints anymore. Corbett Mining Company preferred shares, 40 shares issued to Walter H. Callahan, dated March 1971. Purchase price stamped in the corner, $612. Underneath it, a certificate of deposit, $11,000, opened the same month, same year, First Farmers Trust. Ruth stared at the numbers like they belonged to somebody else's marriage. $612, she said. Earl, we didn't have $600 to spare in 1971. We were 3 months behind on the store's fire insurance that whole year. I remember, Pruitt said quietly. I remember Boss skipping his own paycheck twice that spring so I could keep mine. Then where did this come from? Pruitt turned the certificate over in his hands, careful, the way he'd handled the ledger the night before. Corbett Mining, he said. You remember the office 2 doors down from the store. Shut down in the 70s, not shut down, sold off. The land kept producing coal royalties for years after the office closed, paid out quiet to whoever held the paper. Most folks around here sold their shares back when the company folded, took whatever cash they could get, and ran. He tapped the certificate. Boss didn't sell. He bought more. With what money? I don't know yet. But I'd guess he found a way to squeeze a little out of the store every quarter nobody else noticed, and he put it here instead of the register. Pruitt looked up at her. Boss didn't gamble, Ruth. He planted things and waited. Ruth sat with that a minute, Walter's face rising up in her mind the way it did most days now, unbidden, at the hardware counter with his sleeves rolled and his pencil behind his ear, telling a customer, "No, ma'am, we don't carry that gauge of wire, but Pruitt can order it by Thursday." He never said a word, she said. 51 years. Boss wasn't a man who explained himself. He just did the thing and let it hold. Underneath the CD, folded small, was one more note in the same faded blue ink as the ledger's first page. If you're reading this, Ruthie, it means I'm gone, and you finally turned the last page. Don't let anybody tell you what this is worth before you ask. Ask first. She read it twice, the way she'd read the first line, and this time she understood exactly what he'd meant by counting. What's it worth now, Earl? The shares. The CD with 50 years of interest. Pruitt turned the certificate over again, studying the transfer agent's stamp on the back like it might answer him faster than his own memory could. I can tell you the CD's a straightforward number. We can pull that today, he said. The stock, I honestly don't know. Corbett got bought out twice since the 70s, once by a bigger coal outfit, once by somebody who turned the royalties into some kind of trust. Preferred shares like this they might have split, might have converted, might be worth 10 times what's stamped on that paper, or might be worth nothing at all if nobody's kept the certificate current. So, we don't know. Not yet. I can call a fellow at Whitaker Title over on Maine. He handles mineral rights and old stock transfers for half the county. He'll know inside a day what this actually is. Ruth folded her hands over the certificate like she was covering a hand of cards from a table full of strangers. Then we go see him. Tomorrow, if he's got the time. Today, if he's got the time, Ruth said, and Pruitt almost smiled, the way he had at the cottage, like a man watching an old lesson prove itself all over again. They put everything back in the box except the death certificate, and Pruitt walked her out through the lobby past the tellers, one of whom, a heavy-set woman named Connie, who'd sold nails at the store part-time back in the 80s, caught Ruth's eye and gave her a small, private nod, like she already sensed something moving under the surface of an ordinary Tuesday. Ruth walked home along Main Street instead of waiting for Pruitt's car because the day had turned mild and she wanted the air. She passed the shuttered front of Callahan's Hardware, plywood over the windows now, a real estate sign leaning crooked in the weeds out front, and she stopped a minute the way she always did, hand on the cold brick, saying nothing to it, the way you'd rest a hand on an old friend's shoulder at a funeral. When she got back to the cottage, Duke met her at the door, stiff-legged and glad, and there was an envelope wedged into the frame that hadn't been there that morning. No name on the front. Just Mrs. Callahan, in handwriting that shook a little, the kind of hand belonging to somebody old enough to remember when a fountain pen was the only kind there was. Inside was $50 in small bills and a note. Your husband carried my family on credit through 2 winters we couldn't pay. Never asked me once when I'd settle up. This isn't near enough, but it's what I've got today. No signature. Ruth sat down on the porch step with Duke's head heavy against her knee and the $50 in her lap. And for the first time since the funeral, she let herself cry, not for what she'd lost, but for the plain fact that somewhere in Briar Hollow, 40 years of quiet decency were still being paid back, one small envelope at a time, whether Denise Callahan ever noticed it or not. The next envelope came from a different direction entirely, and it didn't have Ruth's name on it at all. Pruitt picked her up again on Thursday morning, this time with a folder under his arm instead of just his hat. "Dale Whitaker can see us at 10, he said. Title company on Main. He's been doing mineral rights work in this county 30 years. Will he know what an old coal certificate is worth? If anybody in Briar Hollow does, it's Dale." Whitaker Title sat between a barbershop and an insurance office, glass door, bell on top that jingled when Pruitt pushed it open. Dale Whitaker came out from a back room in shirt sleeves, a man built like a fence post, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. "Earl," he said, "and this'll be Mrs. Callahan." "Ruth," she said, and shook his hand. "Walter's Ruth," Dale said, like that settled something in his own mind. "I bought fence nails off your husband for 20 years. Come on back." He sat them at a table covered in county plat maps, took the stock certificate from Pruitt with 2 careful fingers, and laid it flat under a lamp. "Corbett Mining," he said. "Preferred shares. 40 of them." "Is that worth anything?" Ruth asked. Dale didn't answer right away. He turned the certificate over, checked the transfer stamp on the back, then pulled a thick binder off a shelf behind him and started flipping pages, slow, license plates of numbers scrolling under his thumb. Nobody said a word for a full 2 minutes. Ruth watched his face, the way she'd watched Pruitt's over the ledger, waiting for whatever crossed a man's expression when he found something worth finding. "Corbett got bought by Highland Coal in 78, Dale said finally. "Highland got bought by a royalty trust in 91. Shares like these converted twice. Most folks cashed out both times and never looked back. But Walter didn't. No, ma'am. He held through both conversions." Dale looked up at her. "That's 40 original shares. Compounded through 2 conversions and 50 years of quarterly coal royalty payments, most of them reinvested, near as I can tell from the transfer history." "What's it worth, Dale?" Pruitt said. "Today. Straight number." Dale set his glasses down on the table. "Right around $890,000, he said. Ruth's hand went to the table's edge. "That can't be right. I ran it twice, Mrs. Callahan. I don't guess at numbers like this." "And the CD," Pruitt said. "First Farmers pulled the current balance this morning. 11,000 principal. 52 years of compounding. Comes to just over 310,000. Ruth sat very still. 890 and 310, she said, doing the sum the way she'd done sums her whole life, out loud, careful, checking her own math before she trusted it. "That's $1,200,000, 1.2 million, Dale said, "give or take." Nobody spoke for a second. Outside on Main Street, a truck downshifted, ordinary Thursday noise, like the world hadn't just tilted sideways in a back room full of plat maps. "Denise sold my house for $210,000, Ruth said quietly. "Sold the truck for 11. Cleared the joint accounts near as Gary told me, around 119 more. "That's 340, Pruitt said. "She put 60,000 down on a lake house 2 counties over," Ruth said. "Told the movers I wasn't due but $1's worth of old paper." Dale Whitaker looked at the certificate on the table like it was something holy. "Well," he said, "old paper indeed." Ruth folded her hands the same way she had over the box at First Farmers, like she was covering cards from strangers again. "I don't want to touch $1 of it till it's done proper," she said. "Recorded, legal, no shortcuts." "That's smart," Dale said. "I can draw up the paperwork to get the stock retitled in your name alone, given you're the surviving spouse and there's no will contesting it. County clerk records the transfer, same office that gave you the death certificate. How long? A week, maybe less, if nobody objects." "Who'd object?" Ruth asked, though some part of her already knew the shape of the answer before Dale said it. "Anybody with a claim on the estate," Dale said. "Was there a will?" "There was," Pruitt said. "Left everything to Ruth outright. Gary and Denise took the house and the accounts on the theory Ruth wouldn't fight it. Wasn't anything in the will that split it. She just didn't push back." "Then there's nothing to object to," Dale said, "unless somebody tries to say Mrs. Callahan isn't fit to manage it herself." Ruth looked up sharp at that. "Why would anybody say that?" Dale shrugged, mild, a man who'd seen every kind of family fight a county courthouse could produce. "People say all kinds of things when there's money on the table," he said. "I'm not saying anybody will, Just saying it happens. They left Whitaker Title a little after 11, Ruth clutching a folder of her own now, copies of everything, the certificate, the CD statement, the transfer paperwork Dale had promised to file by Monday. Pruitt drove her back toward the cottage, quiet, both of them turning the number over in their heads without needing to say it again. "Earl," Ruth said, somewhere past the shuttered hardware store. "Word's gonna get to Denise. Somebody at that bank, somebody at Whitaker's, somebody's gonna mention it at the diner and it'll travel. Probably faster than you'd like. I don't care about faster. I care what she does when she hears it." Pruitt didn't answer that right away either. He didn't need to, because the answer came 2 days later, on Saturday, when Ruth was out back of the cottage filling Duke's water bowl and a car she didn't recognize pulled into the gravel, and Gary got out of it alone, hat in his hands the way Pruitt carried his, except Gary's hands were shaking in a different way, the way of a man carrying news he didn't want to deliver. "Mama," he said, "we need to talk." "Come sit," Ruth said. "Duke won't bite." Gary sat on the porch step but didn't look at the dog. He looked at his hands. "Denise heard you'd been out to Whitaker Title," he said, "and First Farmers before that. Heard there was some kind of box, some kind of money." "There was," Ruth said. "There is. How much, Mama?" Ruth studied her son's face a long moment, the same face Walter used to make when he was working up to bad news at the dinner table, and decided there wasn't any use lying to him. Not now, not about this. "A little over $1.2 million, she said. Gary went pale under his cap. "Lord," he whispered. "Your daddy built it quiet," Ruth said. 40 years of coal shares nobody else knew he was holding. I didn't know either, Gary, not till 2 weeks ago. Denise is going to lose her mind. I imagine she already has. Some, Ruth said, if she sent you out here instead of coming herself. Gary didn't answer that. He turned his hat over once, twice, the way men in that family always did when they didn't have the words yet. "She's talking to a lawyer, Mama," he said finally, "about guardianship. Says with a sum that size, somebody needs to look out for your interests. Make sure you're not taken advantage of." Ruth set the water bowl down slow, and Duke lapped at it, unbothered, while something colder settled over the porch than the morning air could account for. "Taken advantage of," she repeated. "By who, Gary?" Her son didn't have an answer for that either, and that more than anything he'd said told her everything she needed to know about which direction this was about to come from. Gary's hat kept turning in his hands, round and round like a wheel that couldn't find the road. "She's not saying you're incompetent, Mama," he said. "She's saying a woman living alone, in a little cottage, with that much money coming, people take advantage. She's worried." "She's worried about the money," Ruth said. "Not about me. That's not fair, isn't it?" Ruth folded her hands in her lap and looked at her son, really looked at him, the way she used to look at his report cards before she signed them. "Gary, when did Denise ever ask after my health? My eyes? My blood pressure? 6 weeks your daddy's been gone, and she's asked me exactly once, right before she needed a signature on the house." Gary didn't answer that. "When's she filing?" Ruth asked. "Filing what?" "The guardianship paper, Gary. Lawyers don't just talk, they file." Gary looked down at his boots. "Monday," he said. "County courthouse. She's already got an appointment with a fellow named Ellis Broward." "Monday," Ruth repeated. "That's fast. She wants it done before the stock transfer records. Says if she waits, folks will say she was just after the money." Gary's voice dropped, ashamed of his own sentence before he finished it. "Which she is, Mama. I know she is. I just don't know how to stop her anymore." Ruth reached over and patted his knee, the way she had when he was 7 and scared of thunder. "Then you go home," she said, "and you let me handle Monday." "You're not going to fight her?" "I didn't say that." Gary left without finishing whatever else he'd come to say, and Ruth sat on the step a long while after his car pulled out, Duke's chin heavy on her shoe, watching the gravel road empty out in front of her like a held breath. She called Pruitt from the kitchen phone that evening. "Earl," she said, "Denise is filing for guardianship Monday. A lawyer named Ellis Broward." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause a careful man takes before he says something he already believes. "Broward handles half the ugly divorces in this county," Pruitt said. "He's not cheap and he's not subtle. Can she win? On what grounds? You've got your faculties, Ruth. You drove yourself to the bank. You've got a title company vouching for a legitimate estate transfer already in motion." He paused again. "But a judge doesn't always care about grounds, not right away. Sometimes it's enough to get a hearing date and freeze things up while everybody lawyers up around you. Freeze what up? The stock transfer. If she can get an emergency hearing before Dale's paperwork clears the clerk's office, she can argue the whole estate ought to sit under a court-appointed guardian till things get sorted. And guess who she'd nominate for that job? Ruth's grip tightened on the phone cord. Herself. Or Gary, which amounts to the same thing with her holding the pen. Then we beat Monday, Ruth said. Dale said a week for the county clerk. We don't have a week. Then we make Dale move faster, or we find another door. Ruth looked out the kitchen window at Duke asleep in the last of the porch light, and something in her settled, cold and clear, the way it used to when a customer tried to talk Walter down on a fair price, and Walter simply waited them out. Earl, you said First Farmers holds the box. That's the bank's authority, not the county's. That's right. Can the bank release a certified statement of the box's contents before the transfer records? Something a lawyer could put in front of a judge Monday morning, showing this estate is already accounted for, already moving through proper channels, nothing hidden, nothing needing a stranger's hand on it? There was a silence on the line long enough that Ruth wondered if the call had dropped. Then Pruitt said, slow, like he was turning the idea over and finding it solid. That's not something I do every day. But it's not something the bank can't do either. A certified letter of account, signed by a bank officer, notarized. I'd need the branch manager's sign-off, and I'd need you back in that room with me tomorrow morning. First thing. Tomorrow morning, Ruth said. I'll be there before you unlock the door. She hung up the phone and stood in the little kitchen a minute, hand still resting on the receiver, and Duke lifted his head at the sound of her breathing gone fast and short. It's all right, old boy, she told him. Your master built us a rope. We're just learning how to climb it. She was at First Farmers before 8, coat buttoned wrong in her hurry, and Pruitt was already waiting at the door with a folder and a woman Ruth didn't recognize, silver-haired, sharp-suited, introduced as the branch manager, Linda Voss. Mr. Pruitt filled me in, Voss said, shaking Ruth's hand firm. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Callahan, and I'm sorrier still that a bank has to get pulled into a family's private business. But we can put together a certified statement of box contents, account status, and transfer paperwork in progress. That's simple record keeping. That's ours to give. How fast? I can have it notarized and signed by noon. Ruth exhaled something that had been sitting in her chest since Gary's car pulled out of the gravel the day before. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Voss said. A letter like this tells a judge the facts. It doesn't decide anything. Judges decide things. I understand. Does your son have his own lawyer? Separate from his wife's? Ruth blinked. I don't believe so. Voss and Pruitt traded a look Ruth couldn't fully read. Careful, the kind two professionals share when they know something a family doesn't want to hear yet. You might want to see he gets one, Voss said, before Monday. A man who lets his wife's attorney speak for both of them in a guardianship hearing about his own mother is a man who's going to regret it either way this goes. Ruth thought about Gary's hat turning in his hands on her porch step, the shame in his voice when he said which she is, Mama, I know she is. Maybe there was still enough of Walter's boy left in him to hear that kind of advice. The letter was ready by 11:30. 3 pages, county seal stamp waiting on Voss's notary embosser. The language plain and certain in a way Ruth found she trusted more than any kindness anyone had offered her since the funeral. Box 114 contents inventoried and verified. Estate transfer initiated through Whitaker title, filed in good order. No irregularity found in account history or asset disposition. That last line, Ruth said, reading it twice. No irregularity found. That's the sentence that matters, Pruitt said. That's the sentence that tells a judge there's nothing here needing a stranger's hand. Ruth folded the letter into the same folder as Dale's paperwork. The stock certificate copies, the CD statement, everything now traveling together like a small, stubborn army. She thought of Walter's line in blue ink. Don't let anybody tell you what this is worth before you ask, and thought that maybe he'd meant something bigger than money by it, something about a woman's right to stand in a room and not be talked over. She drove to Gary's that afternoon, the first time she'd been back to that house since the day the movers carried her chair down the front steps. She didn't go inside. She stood on the walk and waited until Gary came out alone, Denise's car gone from the drive. You need to get your own lawyer, Gary, Ruth said. No greeting, no softening it. Not Denise's, not Broward, your own. Before Monday. Mama, I'm not asking you to choose between your wife and your mother today, Ruth said, though some part of her wondered if that was exactly what she was asking. I'm telling you, a man ought to have his own voice in a room where his own mother's future gets decided. That's all. That's not betrayal. That's just sense. Gary looked at her a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes that Ruth hadn't seen since he was young enough to still ask her for advice instead of avoiding her calls. I'll think on it, he said. Don't think too long, Ruth said. Monday's close. She drove back to the cottage with the folder on the passenger seat like a second passenger, and that night, with Duke curled against her hip and the lamp burning low, she took out Walter's ledger one more time and read the first page again, the way she had every night since the loose panel gave up its secret. Count every page, Ruthie, the last one's worth more than the rest. She understood it fully now, she thought. Not just the box, not just the money, the waiting. The proof that a man could build something in the dark, quiet as a root growing under a floor, and trust that one day the floor would need to hold weight it was never expected to hold. Monday was 2 days off. Ruth closed the ledger, set it on the nightstand within reach of her hand, and turned off the lamp, listening to Duke's slow breathing in the dark and to her own heart, steadier now than it had been in 6 weeks. Monday came in gray and quiet over Coldwater Creek Road. No thunder, no signs, just an ordinary morning that happened to carry a courthouse date inside it. Ruth wore her navy dress, the one she'd worn to Walter's funeral, because it was the only dress she owned that said, "Take me seriously." Duke watched her from the porch rail like he knew something was different, ears up, not barking, just watching. Pruitt met her in the courthouse parking lot at 8:30, folder under his arm, tie straight for once. You didn't have to come, Ruth said. Wasn't asking permission, Pruitt said. Boss would have come for me. I'm coming for you. They found Gary on the steps, and beside him, a woman Ruth had never met, briefcase in hand, maybe 40, sharp eyes. Mama, Gary said, this is Carol Ann Vess, my lawyer. Ruth felt something loosen in her chest at that word, my. You did it, she said. Voss was right, Gary said. I wasn't going to sit in that room and let Ellis Broward speak for me like I don't have my own tongue. Carol Ann shook Ruth's hand, brisk and businesslike. Mrs. Callahan, I've read the petition. It's thin. Broward's asking for an emergency guardianship on the theory you're, quote, isolated and vulnerable to undue influence. Undue influence from who? Ruth asked. He doesn't say. That's the thin part. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than Ruth expected, wood-paneled, a flag in the corner, a judge's bench that looked older than the building around it. Denise was already seated at the petitioner's table, dressed sharp, hair done. A man beside her Ruth took for Ellis Broward, silver tie, folder stacked with color tabs. Denise didn't look at Ruth when she came in. She looked at Gary, and something crossed her face Ruth couldn't quite name, surprise maybe, or the first crack of it. Judge Hollis Andrade presiding, the bailiff said, and everyone stood. Judge Andrade was younger than Ruth expected too, reading glasses low on her nose, voice flat and businesslike from the first word. This is a petition for emergency guardianship over the person and estate of Ruth Ellen Callahan, she said. Mr. Broward, you're asking me to move fast. Tell me why. Broward stood, buttoned his jacket. Your Honor, Mrs. Callahan is 74 years old, recently widowed, living alone in a cottage with no family nearby. She's come into possession of an estate valued potentially over $1 million, discovered under unusual circumstances. My client, her daughter-in-law, is concerned that a woman in grief, isolated, is vulnerable to being taken advantage of. By who? Judge Andrade asked, exactly the question Ruth had asked Gary on the porch step. Broward hesitated half a second. We don't allege a specific bad actor at this time, Your Honor. We're asking the court to appoint a guardian out of caution. Caution, Judge Andrade repeated, like she was tasting the word and didn't care for it. Ms. Vess, you're here for the son? I am, Your Honor, Carol Ann said, standing. And I'd like to enter into the record a certified letter from First Farmers Trust, signed by branch manager Linda Voss, dated this past Friday. She handed a copy to the bailiff, one to Broward's table, one to the bench. Ruth watched Denise's eyes catch on it, watched her lean toward Broward to read over his shoulder. Judge Andrade read it slow, no hurry in her at all. Box contents inventoried and verified, she read aloud, half to herself. Estate transfer initiated through Whitaker title, filed in good order. No irregularity found in account history or asset disposition. She looked up over her glasses. That's a fairly clean bill of health for an estate somebody's trying to call chaotic. Your Honor, Broward started, a bank letter isn't a substitute for judicial oversight. No, Judge Andrade agreed, but it's evidence. And right now it's the only evidence in this room that speaks to Mrs. Callahan's actual affairs instead of speculation about them. She turned to Ruth directly, first time all morning. Mrs. Callahan, are you managing your own finances at present? I am, Your Honor, Ruth said, standing without being told to, the way she'd stood behind Walter's counter for 40 years when a customer needed a straight answer. I drove myself to the bank. I hired my own title company. I've got my own folder of paperwork, and I keep my own books, same as I did for my husband's store for 4 decades. She does the sums out loud, Pruitt said from the gallery, not asked, and Judge Andrade's mouth twitched like she was fighting a smile. Mr. Pruitt, I didn't call you, she said, but thank you. She looked back down at the letter, then at Broward, then at Denise, who still hadn't spoken a word, just sat with her hands folded tight enough to whiten the knuckles. I'm not seeing grounds for an emergency guardianship here, Judge Andrade said. Mrs. Callahan has counsel of her own choosing, a documented orderly estate transfer, and a bank willing to vouch for her competence in writing. The petition is dismissed. Denise's chair scraped back before the judge had even finished the sentence. Your Honor, she said, standing, voice too loud for the room, with respect, this happened fast. There's $1 million that showed up out of nowhere, and now everybody's acting like that's normal. Sit down, Mrs. Callahan, Judge Andrade said, not unkindly, but final. Money appearing isn't a crime, and this court doesn't exist to help you get a bigger piece of it. The room went quiet enough that Ruth could hear the ceiling fan ticking overhead. Denise sat. Broward leaned over and murmured something to her, and whatever it was, it didn't calm her, because her jaw stayed set the whole rest of the hearing, eyes fixed somewhere past Ruth's shoulder like she was already working the next angle before this one had cooled. Outside on the courthouse steps, Gary hugged his mother, quick, awkward, the way he'd hugged her since he was 12 and decided hugging was for babies, and Ruth held on a second longer than he expected. Thank you, she said, for getting your own lawyer. Carol Ann says the petition being dismissed doesn't end it, Gary said. Denise can still contest things through probate. Try to argue the will itself, maybe. Say Daddy wasn't right in the head when he wrote it. Carol Ann nodded, grim. Broward's not going to fold on the first hearing. He'll look for another door. Pruitt's jaw tightened at that. Then we ought to move on the stock transfer today, before Denise's lawyer finds a fresh angle to freeze it. Dale said a week, Ruth said. Dale said a week for the ordinary way, Pruitt said. There's nothing ordinary about this anymore. They didn't wait for the parking lot to empty. Pruitt drove Ruth straight from the courthouse to First Farmers, Carol Ann following in her own car with copies of the dismissal order, still warm from the courthouse printer. I want this filed with the county clerk before lunch, Pruitt said, striding through the bank doors like a man 40 years younger. Dale can walk it over himself if he has to. Linda Voss met them at the counter, already reading the dismissal order Carol Ann handed her, nodding along. Judge threw it out, Voss said. Good. She did, Ruth said, but Denise isn't done. Gary says she'll try the will next. Voss's eyes went to Pruitt, something passing between them, quick and certain. Then there's no reason to wait on the transfer, Voss said. Box 114's been verified. Stock's authenticated. Every hour it sits unrecorded is an hour somebody's lawyer gets to invent a reason to stop it. Ruth thought of Walter's handwriting again. Blue ink gone soft with age, count every page, Ruthie, and understood, standing in that lobby with the fluorescent lights humming overhead, that the last page wasn't the ledger anymore. It was this. It was today. Then let's not wait, she said. Behind her, through the bank's front glass, a car pulled into the lot too fast, gravel spitting under the tires, and Ruth didn't need to turn around to know whose car it was. She turned anyway, and there was Denise, out of her car before it had fully stopped, heels crossing the lot at a pace that had nothing patient left in it at all. Denise pushed through the glass doors without waiting for anyone to hold them. Her heels rang hard on the tile, and every teller at the counter looked up. "Ruth Callahan," she said, loud enough that a woman filling out a deposit slip stepped back. "You think you can just walk into a bank and lock me out of my own family's money?" "Your family's money," Pruitt said, calm, "or your husband's mother's money?" Denise's eyes cut to him. "Who are you?" "Earl Pruitt, vice president of this branch." He didn't offer his hand. "I knew your father-in-law since 1968. I don't believe we've met." "We haven't," Denise said, "and I don't much care to now." Carol Ann Vess stepped forward, folder against her chest. "Mrs. Callahan, this is a place of business. If you have a legal matter, my office is happy to hear it in writing." "I don't need your office," Denise said. "I need somebody in this building to explain why a bank is helping an old woman hide assets from a guardianship court." "There's no guardianship," Carol Ann said. "Judge Andrade dismissed the petition an hour ago. You were there. That doesn't mean this is over." "No," Carol Ann agreed. "It means you lost round one." Ruth stood quiet through all of it, hands folded, the way she used to stand behind Walter's counter when a customer got loud over a returned drill bit. Denise finally turned to her, and something in her face cracked open. Not softer, just raw. "You think Gary's gonna thank you for this?" Denise said. "Humiliating me in front of a judge, dragging bankers and lawyers into a family matter?" "I didn't drag anybody," Ruth said. "You filed the papers, Denise. I just showed up. You showed up with a certified letter like you're running a corporation." "I ran a store for 40 years, Ruth said. "I know how to keep a paper trail." Denise's jaw worked. She looked at Voss, who'd come out from behind the counter, arms crossed, saying nothing yet, letting the room breathe. "I want to see the box," Denise said. "What box?" Voss said, flat. "Don't play dumb with me. Whatever's in that safe deposit box you people keep whispering about. I'm entitled to see it. I'm family." "You're not on the signature card," Voss said. "You're not the executor. You're not even named in the will, Mrs. Callahan. I can't show you a shoebox of gum wrappers if your name's not on the account, let alone anything in that vault. Then show Gary." "Gary can ask his mother," Voss said. "That's between the two of them." Denise's hands were shaking now, small and quick, the kind of shake that comes from being cornered instead of scared. "You people have no idea what you're doing to me," she said. "I have a closing date. Friday. 3 days. $60,000 down on that house, and the seller's already told my agent they'll keep every dime of it if I don't have the balance wired by Friday afternoon." The room went still enough that Ruth heard the ceiling vents cycle on. "How much is the balance?" Pruitt asked, quiet. $210,000, Denise said, and her voice cracked on the number like she hadn't meant to say it out loud. "I told them it was coming. I told them the estate was clearing probate any day." "You told a seller that before probate cleared?" Carol Ann said. "Not a question." "I told them what I believed," Denise snapped. "You believed my husband's whole estate belonged to you before a judge or a lawyer ever looked at it," Ruth said. "That's not belief, Denise. That's a bet. You made a bet, and you made it with money that wasn't yours yet." Denise turned on her, sharper than she'd been all morning. "That money was going to be Gary's. Gary's mine. Math isn't complicated. The math," Ruth said, "was never yours to do." For a second, nobody moved. Then Denise laughed, short and ugly. No humor in it at all. "You're standing in a bank lobby telling me about math over a ledger I handed you like a napkin 6 weeks ago. You said yourself it wasn't worth anything." "I never said that," Ruth said. "You said that." Denise's mouth opened, then closed. Something behind her eyes shifted, quick, like she was replaying the memory and not liking where it landed. "It doesn't matter what either of us said," she managed. "What matters is I have a contract and a deadline, and a family that's supposed to be helping each other instead of hiring lawyers against each other." "Nobody hired a lawyer against you," Pruitt said. "Mrs. Callahan hired one for herself. That's different than what you did. And what did I do? You hired Ellis Broward," Carol Ann said, "and filed to have your mother-in-law declared incompetent 3 weeks after her husband's funeral. That's not family helping family, Mrs. Callahan. That's a woman trying to get a court to hand her a fortune she couldn't get any other way." Denise's face went white, then red, fast enough that Ruth almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "You don't know what it's like," Denise said, voice dropping now, less fight in it, something closer to panic underneath. "Gary and I have been treading water for years. 2 mortgages. His hours got cut at the plant. I saw a chance to fix all of it in 1 week, and I took it, and now everybody's acting like that makes me a monster. Nobody called you a monster, Ruth said. I called you fast. There's a difference, but it cost the same in the end. Denise looked at her a long moment, and for the first time all morning, she didn't have an answer ready. I need that money by Friday, she said finally, quieter, or I lose the deposit. $60,000. Gone. Just gone. That's a shame, Voss said, not unkindly, but it's not this bank's shame to fix. Can't you release something? An advance? A loan against the estate? Anything? No, Voss said. And even if I could, I wouldn't, not to a name that isn't on the account. Denise's eyes went to Ruth one more time, and there was a flicker there Ruth almost recognized from years back, from a younger Denise sitting at her kitchen table the first Thanksgiving she'd come around, nervous, trying too hard to be liked. That girl was buried somewhere under all this now, and Ruth wasn't sure anymore if digging her back up was even possible. You could help me, Denise said, if you wanted to. You could tell them to speed up the transfer, tell Gary to co-sign something, anything. You're just choosing not to. I'm choosing to let the law work the way it's supposed to, Ruth said. Same as you tried to make it work for you 3 weeks ago. Only difference is, I'm not asking it to move faster than it's built to move. Denise didn't answer that. She looked around the lobby once, at Pruitt, at Voss, at Carol Ann's folder, at Ruth standing steady in her navy dress, and whatever calculation she was running behind her eyes, it didn't land anywhere good, because her shoulders dropped just slightly, the fight going out of her like air out of a tire nobody had noticed was low until it was flat. This isn't over, she said, but it came out thinner than she meant it to. It rarely is, Pruitt said, on a Monday. Denise turned and walked out, heels quieter going than they'd been coming in, and the glass door swung shut behind her without a sound. Voss exhaled first. Well, she said, that's a woman with a closing date and no closing funds. Friday, Carol Ann said, already flipping through her folder. That gives us the rest of today and tomorrow to get the transfer recorded at the county clerk before her sellers do whatever sellers do when a buyer goes quiet. Can we make Friday? Ruth asked. Pruitt looked at Voss. Voss looked at the clock behind the counter, then back at Ruth. We can make tomorrow, she said, if Dale Whitaker's willing to walk paperwork over himself instead of mailing it. He will be, Ruth said. He told me himself, whatever it takes. Pruitt almost smiled. Boss used to say the same thing about a hardware order, whatever it takes, long as it's honest. He looked toward the door Denise had gone through, gravel still settling outside where her tires had spun loose on the way in. Let's go be honest quick then, before Friday gets here and finds her without a way to pay for it. Dale Whitaker met them at the county clerk's counter with the transfer documents already tabbed, sticky notes marking every line that needed a signature. The clerk, a heavyset man named Foss who'd stamped Walter's business license back in 1979, took one look at the paperwork and whistled low. Corbett Mining preferred, he said. Don't see that name come through here anymore. Company folded into a bigger outfit years back. Shares still pay, though? 40 of them, Pruitt said. Matured CD alongside it. Combined, the title companies put the estate at $1.2 million. Foss looked up at Ruth like he was seeing her for the first time. That's a lot of hardware nails, Mrs. Callahan. Wasn't nails that bought it, Ruth said. Was patience. Foss stamped the pages one by one, slow, careful, the way a man stamps something he knows matters. Carol Ann watched every seal fall like she was counting them. When the last page went into the recorder's tray, she let out a breath Ruth hadn't noticed she'd been holding. Recorded, Foss said. Public record as of 11:40 this morning. Nobody unwinds this now. Not a judge, not a lawyer, not an act of God. Good, Pruitt said, because I don't trust acts of God this week. They stepped out onto Main Street into a July sun that had climbed high enough to bleach the sidewalk white. Ruth stood a moment on the courthouse steps, folder against her chest, and thought about Walter's handwriting again, the way it slanted right like it was always in a hurry to get to the next word. Count every page, Ruthie. She'd counted them all now. Every one. Carol Ann's phone rang before they'd made it to the car. She answered, listened, her face changing by degrees, from calm to something tighter. That was Broward's office, she said, hanging up. Denise filed an amended petition an hour ago. Not guardianship this time. What then? Pruitt asked. We'll contest, Carol Ann said. She's alleging Walter lacked testamentary capacity when he signed the will 4 years ago. Says he was on blood pressure medication that affected his judgment and that Ruth exerted undue influence over the drafting. Ruth felt the words land somewhere behind her ribs, sharp and strange. Undue influence, she said. I was married to him 46 years. That's not influence, that's a marriage. I know, Carol Ann said, but it buys her a hearing date, and a hearing date buys her time to keep telling her sellers something's still moving. When's the hearing? Ruth asked. 3 weeks out. Judge Andrade again, far as I can tell from the docket. Pruitt shook his head. 3 weeks won't save her closing Friday. No, Carol Ann agreed, but it might be about something else now. Might not be the house anymore. Might just be about making Ruth bleed lawyer fees until she gives up something to make it stop. Ruth thought about that, standing on the sidewalk with the sun heavy on her shoulders, and felt something in her go still and cold instead of afraid. She's not going to bleed me, she said. I kept books through 3 recessions. I know what a war of attrition costs, and I know how to outlast one. They dropped Carol Ann at her office and Pruitt drove Ruth home himself, the beagle waiting at the cottage door, like he always did now, tail going before the car had even stopped. Ruth let him out, watched him hobble stiff-legged into the grass, and sat down on the porch step to catch her breath. Gary's truck pulled up 20 minutes later. He came alone, no Denise, which told Ruth something before he'd said a word. He sat down beside her on the step, elbows on his knees, staring at Ellis Broward's amended filing without really reading it, just holding the fact of it in his hands. She didn't tell me she was filing this, Gary said. Found out from Carol Ann, same as you. You believe it? Ruth asked. That your daddy wasn't in his right mind? No, Gary said quiet. I watched him balance a register to the penny 2 months before he died. Man wasn't confused about anything. He rubbed his face with both hands. She's not doing this for the will, Mama. She's doing it because Friday's coming, and she doesn't have another card to play. I know, Ruth said. I told her to call the sellers. Tell them the truth, ask for an extension. Gary's voice cracked slightly. She won't. Says asking for more time makes her look weak in front of people she's trying to impress. Impress with what? Ruth said. A house she can't pay for? Gary didn't answer that. He looked out at the beagle nosing through the grass, tail still wagging even though there was nothing there to chase, just habit, just an old dog doing what old dogs do because it's what's always worked. I love her, he said, but I don't know how to stop her anymore. She's scared, and scared makes her reach for things that don't belong to her. I know that feeling, Ruth said. I've been scared plenty since your daddy died. Difference is, I didn't go looking in anybody else's pocket to fix it. Gary was quiet a long moment. What happens Friday? He asked. If she can't close, she loses the deposit, Ruth said. $60,000 gone. That's her problem to solve, Gary, not mine and not yours either, unless you signed something you didn't tell me about. His silence answered before his mouth did. Gary, I co-signed the earnest money agreement, he said low, back in May, before the funeral even. She said it was just a formality, said the estate would clear before it mattered. He looked at his hands. I didn't read it close enough. Turns out if the deal falls through and it's ruled a breach instead of a simple walkaway, both our names are on the hook for the difference between the contract price and whatever the sellers eventually get for the house on relist. Ruth felt her stomach drop, quiet and cold. How much difference are we talking? Could be nothing, Gary said. Could be 40, 50,000 if the market's soft and they can't get the same price twice. And your name's on that, both our names. Ruth sat with that a moment, the porch boards warm under her, the beagle finally settling into a patch of shade with a groan. Then you'd best call Carol Ann tonight, she said. Not for Denise's sake, for yours. You've got a family to think of too, Gary, whether or not your wife's thinking of it for you right now. I know, Gary said. I already left her a message. He looked over at his mother, something in his face gone younger suddenly, the boy underneath the man showing through for just a second. I'm sorry you're in the middle of all this. I'm not in the middle, Ruth said. I'm just standing where I've always stood. Your daddy's the one who put a fortune where nobody could touch it but the person he trusted to find it. That's not me causing trouble. That's 40 years of him keeping his word. Gary managed a small, tired smile. Guess I should have read the ledger closer myself back when Denise handed it to you. Guess you should have, Ruth said, not unkindly. But you didn't, and here we are, and there's no changing that now. Only thing left to do is decide what you do next, knowing what you know. Gary nodded slowly, folded the will contest papers back along their crease, and stood. I'll call Carol Ann in the morning, see if there's a way to get my name off that agreement before Friday. You do that, Ruth said. And Gary, whatever your wife decides to do about her deposit, that debt is hers to carry. Don't let her hand you half of it just because you happen to love her. He didn't answer, just nodded once and walked back to his truck slower than he'd come, like the weight of it had only now settled all the way into his shoulders. Ruth watched him go, then looked down at the beagle, snoring soft in the shade, one ear twitching at a fly that wasn't worth the trouble of chasing. He'll figure it, she said to the dog, or maybe to herself. Or he won't. Either way, Friday's coming whether any of us are ready. She went inside, set the folder of recorded documents on the kitchen table next to Walter's ledger, and for a long moment just looked at the two of them side by side, cracked leather and fresh county paper, 40 years and 1 week, sitting there like they belonged to the same story after all. Morning came in gray at first, then gold, and Ruth was already up before the beagle stirred. She'd slept maybe 4 hours, long enough. She was at the kitchen table with coffee going cold when Carol Ann called. Ellis Broward filed something else, Carol Ann said. No hello, just that. What now? A motion for a temporary restraining order. Emergency hearing this afternoon, 4 o'clock, Judge Andrade's courtroom. Carol Ann paused. He wants the estate assets frozen. Box 114, the CD, the Corbett shares. All of it, locked down pending the undue influence hearing. Ruth set her cup down slow. He can do that? After it's already recorded at the clerk's office, he can ask. Judges don't always say yes, but if Andrade signs it, the bank can't release another dime, and the county has to note the freeze against the recorded transfer. Carol Ann's voice tightened. It wouldn't undo what's done, but it'd stop anything else from moving. No closing funds for anybody, no further disbursement. Everything sits. Denise still gets nothing either way then. Denise doesn't care about getting something right now, Carol Ann said. She cares about you not having it. A freeze buys her time to keep hammering the will contest, and it keeps Gary's earnest money mess in limbo too, which might actually be the point. Muddy water's easier to argue in. Ruth looked out the window at the beagle, stretching himself awake in a slice of sun on the porch boards. 4 o'clock, she said. That gives us today. That gives us 6 hours, Carol Ann said. I need you there. I need Earl Pruitt there too, if he'll come speak to the account history. Judges like a banker better than they like a widow, sad as that is to say. He'll come, Ruth said. Man hasn't said no to anything yet. She called Pruitt before she'd even finished her coffee. He answered on the second ring, voice already moving fast, like he'd been waiting for bad news since Denise stormed out the lobby the day before. 4 o'clock, he repeated, once she'd told him. I'll be there. Voss too, probably, if Andrade wants bank records instead of just a body in a suit. Carol Ann says a freeze wouldn't undo the transfer, just stop it moving further. That's the legal read, Pruitt said. But Ruth, listen, if that freeze goes on for months while a will contest crawls through the docket, it doesn't matter that the money's yours on paper. You can't touch it, can't spend it, can't invest it, can't so much as move it to a different account. Denise doesn't need to win the case. She just needs to keep you frozen long enough that it feels like losing. Ruth thought about that a moment. The beagle had made it to the door now, nosing at the screen, patient as ever. Then I guess this afternoon matters more than I figured it did. It does, Pruitt said. You want me to bring the ledger? I'll bring the ledger, Ruth said. Man argued with me about it for 6 weeks. Feels wrong to leave it home now. Gary showed up at noon, before she'd even finished feeding the dog, his face gray in a way that told Ruth he hadn't slept much either. He had a folder of his own this time, thinner than Carol Ann's, but he held it like it weighed more than it looked. I talked to a lawyer this morning, he said, not Broward. Somebody Carol Ann recommended just for me, about the earnest money agreement. And he thinks I can get released from it if I can show I signed under a misrepresentation. Denise told me the estate was already clearing when she had me sign in May. It wasn't. Wasn't even close. He rubbed the back of his neck. Feels rotten, using that against my own wife. It's not against her, Ruth said. It's just true. Sometimes those end up being the same thing, and that's not your fault, Gary. He nodded, not quite convinced, and looked toward the porch where the beagle had gone back to dozing in the warm boards. Denise doesn't know about the TRO hearing yet. Broward hasn't told her the time, just told her he filed it. She's been calling around all morning trying to get a bridge loan against the deposit. Nobody's biting. She'll be there at 4, Ruth said, whether Broward tells her the hour or not. Women like Denise find out where the fight is. Gary managed something close to a smile, thin and tired. Yeah, she will. At 2:30, Ruth changed into the navy dress again. The same one from the bank, because it was the only good one she had that still fit right, and because Walter had always said a woman shows up to a fight in whatever's already proven itself. She packed the ledger into her bag, the recorded transfer papers folded on top of it, and sat on the porch step until Pruitt's car came up Coldwater Creek Road at 2:45. "You look ready," he said when she got in. "I look tired," Ruth said. Tired and ready aren't always different things. The courthouse lobby was busier than the day before, a different docket running, families waiting on benches with the particular stillness of people who don't want to be there. Carol Ann met them near the elevator, a fresh folder under her arm, thicker than yesterday's. "Judge Andrade's already seen the filing," she said, walking fast, Ruth and Pruitt falling in step. "I've got the recorded transfer, the bank's account history, and Walter's original will, notarized, 4 years old, no amendments, no red flags. If Broward wants to argue undue influence, he's arguing against a paper trail that doesn't bend. And if the judge grants the freeze anyway," Ruth said, "just to be safe until the contest gets heard." Carol Ann's jaw tightened. "Then we live with the freeze, and we fight the contest as fast as the docket allows. But Ruth, judges don't love freezing money for months on a shaky petition. Andrade's going to want to see something concrete before he locks down over $1 million. That's where you and Earl come in." They reached the courtroom door. Through the small window in it, Ruth could see the room filling, benches only half full but enough, and near the front, back straight, hands folded tight in her lap, sat Denise. Alone. No Gary beside her this time, because Gary was walking in through the same door his mother was, on the other side of the argument now, whether he'd meant to end up there or not. Denise turned at the sound of the door, saw all three of them together, and something crossed her face that wasn't anger this time. It looked, for just a second, like fear. Ruth held the ledger a little tighter against her side and walked in anyway. Judge Andrade's courtroom smelled like every courtroom Ruth had ever sat in. Cold coffee and old carpet. A flag standing stiff in the corner like it had given up on moving. She took a seat behind Carol Ann, Pruitt beside her, the ledger bag resting against her ankle. Denise sat 2 rows up, alone, spine straight, a legal pad in her lap with nothing written on it yet. Ellis Broward stood when the judge came in, buttoning his jacket like a man performing confidence he didn't quite own. Judge Andrade looked younger than Ruth expected, maybe 50, reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, a stack of folders already open in front of her. "Emergency motion for temporary restraining order," Andrade said. "Broward Legal Group on behalf of Denise Callahan. Let's hear it fast, counselor." "I've got a full docket behind this one." Broward cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we're asking the court to freeze all estate assets tied to Walter Callahan's death, pending resolution of a will contest my client filed this morning, specifically a safe deposit box, a certificate of deposit, and shares of preferred stock, currently in the possession or control of Ruth Callahan." "Grounds," Andrade said, not looking up from the folder. "Undue influence in the drafting of the will, and irreparable harm if these assets are liquidated or transferred before the contest is heard." Andrade looked up now. "Has anything already been transferred?" "Recorded this morning, Your Honor," Carol Ann said, standing. "County Clerk, 11:40 a.m. Deed and certificate both. Public record." Andrade's eyebrows went up a fraction. "Then what exactly are we freezing, counselor? You're asking me to lock a barn door on a horse that's 3 fields over. We're asking the court to prevent further disbursement," Broward said, "and to preserve the asset in place until the contest can be heard." "Preserve it from what?" Andrade asked. Mrs. Callahan spending her own inheritance? A few people on the benches shifted. Ruth kept her face still, hands folded over her purse, the way she'd folded them at every bank counter and church pew for 50 years. Your Honor, Broward said, we believe Mrs. Callahan exerted influence over a man in declining health, 4 years before his death, and that the will reflects that influence rather than his true wishes. 4 years is a long con for undue influence, Andrade said. Usually, I see that argument closer to the signing. You have medical records? We're requesting time to obtain them. So no. Andrade set down her pen. Ms. Voss, I understand you represent Mrs. Callahan. I do, Your Honor, Carol Ann said, and I'd like to call a witness if the court will allow it. Earl Pruitt, Vice President at First Farmers Trust. He can speak to 40 years of account history on the Callahan estate. Go ahead. Pruitt stood, buttoned his own jacket, walked to the small witness stand like he'd done it 100 times, though Ruth doubted he ever had. He raised his hand, took the oath, sat. Mr. Pruitt, Carol Ann said, how long did you know Walter Callahan? Since 1968, Pruitt said. I swept his floors before I could legally drive. Man taught me how to balance a till before I could balance a checkbook of my own. And in your professional capacity, what do you know about the accounts in question? Box 114 was opened under Walter's name in 1971, Pruitt said, never touched by anyone but him in 50-some years, far as our records show. The certificate of deposit inside matured on its own schedule, nobody manipulating dates or terms. 40 shares of Corbett Mining preferred stock, purchased the same year, held quiet the whole time. He glanced at Ruth just once. Man never told a soul. Not his wife, not his son. Kept it separate on purpose. Why would he do that? Andrade asked, direct. My honest guess, Your Honor. So nobody could touch it but the one person he trusted to go looking. Pruitt's voice didn't waver. That happened to be his wife. Not because she talked him into anything, because he built it that way from the start, and she's the only one who ever counted every page like he told her to. Andrade made a note. Mr. Pruitt, has the bank seen any indication in 40 years that Walter Callahan was of unsound mind regarding these accounts? None, Pruitt said. Man balanced his own store ledger by hand 2 months before he passed. To the penny. Broward stood. Objection. Your Honor, the witness isn't a medical professional. Overruled, Andrade said. He's a banker testifying to banking behavior, which is exactly the kind of testimony I called this hearing to hear. Sit down, counselor. Ruth watched Denise's shoulders go rigid 2 rows up. The legal pad in her lap was still blank. Carol Ann turned back to the judge. Your Honor, we'd also note that the petitioner has an earnest money agreement on a separate property, $60,000, contingent on a closing this Friday. We believe the timing of both the guardianship petition and this contest tracks that deadline rather than any genuine concern about Walter Callahan's capacity. Is that true, counselor? Andrade asked Broward. That's not relevant to the motion before the court. It's entirely relevant to the motion before the court, Andrade said. You're asking me to freeze over $1 million belonging to a 74-year-old widow on a 4-year-old will with no medical evidence 3 weeks before your own client needs cash for an unrelated house closing. That's not a coincidence I'm inclined to reward. The room went quiet enough that Ruth could hear the air conditioning cycle on somewhere behind the walls. Your Honor, Broward tried again, irreparable harm still applies if I've heard enough on the freeze, Andrade said. Motion for temporary restraining order is denied. The estate transfer stands as recorded. If Mrs. Denise Callahan wants to pursue a will contest on the merits, she's welcome to file for a hearing on the normal docket with actual medical evidence, and I'll hear it in the order it comes. She looked at Broward over her glasses. But I'd think hard about what you're spending your client's money filing, counselor. Motions aren't free, and neither is my patience. Broward sat down slowly. Denise didn't move at all, staring straight ahead like the ruling hadn't landed yet, like some part of her was still waiting for a different sentence to come out of the judge's mouth. One more matter, Andrade said, flipping a page. There's a co-signed earnest money agreement referenced in the filings. Mr. Gary Callahan, are you in the courtroom? Gary stood from the back row, startled. Yes, Your Honor. This isn't the venue for a contract dispute, but I'll note for the record that any breach liability tied to that agreement is a separate civil matter from the estate contest, and nothing in today's ruling resolves it one way or the other. Andrade closed the folder. Courts adjourned on this motion. Next case. People started gathering coats and folders. Ruth stayed seated a moment, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since the phone rang that morning. Pruitt came back from the stand and sat down beside her, tugging his tie loose half an inch. "That went about as well as it could have," he murmured. "Man used the word coincidence like it tasted bad in his mouth," Ruth said. "I liked that." Carol Ann packed her folder, satisfied but not smiling yet. Denise still has her will contest. Judge just made it a lot more expensive to keep pushing without real evidence, and she still got no closing money for Friday. Ruth stood, smoothing her navy dress, and found Denise waiting for her in the aisle. Broward already gone ahead of her toward the doors like he had somewhere else to be. "You think this is over?" Denise said. "Low? Just for Ruth?" "No," Ruth said. "I think it's Tuesday and Friday's still coming, and I don't believe a judge in Kentucky is going to conjure you $60,000 between now and then." Denise's jaw tightened. "Gary told you about the cosign." "Gary told me the truth," Ruth said. "Something you might try sometime. Might save you a filing fee or two." "You don't know what it's like," Denise said, voice cracking just slightly, the first crack Ruth had heard in it since the day the ledger landed in her lap. "Watching everyone decide you're the villain because you wanted something better for your family." "I don't think you're a villain, Denise," Ruth said. "I think you're scared. And you've been scared so long you forgot there's other ways to fix scared besides taking things that aren't yours." She adjusted her purse on her shoulder. "Your husband loves you. That's not nothing. But love doesn't cover a deposit, and it won't cover the difference if that house sells for less the second time around." Denise didn't answer. She turned and walked out fast, heels sharp against the courthouse floor, past Gary without a word, past Broward without waiting for him either. Gary caught up to Ruth instead, looking somewhere between relieved and wrung out. "She's not going to forgive any of us for this," he said. "Maybe not today," Ruth said. "But Friday's going to force her hand one way or another, and how she handles that is going to tell you a lot more about your marriage than this hearing did." Outside, the afternoon had gone hazy with heat, cicadas going hard in the courthouse trees. Pruitt walked Ruth to the car, quiet for a block before he spoke again. "You know this doesn't end Friday," he said. "Denise loses her deposit, sure. But that will contest doesn't disappear just because a judge called it thin." "I know," Ruth said, "but thin's better than sharp. I can outlast thin." Pruitt almost smiled. 40 years married to Walter Callahan, and you still sound exactly like him when you say things like that." "Good," Ruth said. "Somebody ought to." She got in the car, the ledger bag settled against her feet, and watched Briar Hollow slide by the window, Depot Street and its shuttered storefront, Main and the bank sign catching the sun. Friday was 3 days off. She intended to be standing when it came. The morning after the hearing, Ruth walked to Depot Street before the heat set in. Callahan's Hardware still had the old sign up, faded green letters, a padlock rusted onto the door since March. She stood on the sidewalk a long minute, just looking. Pruitt found her there around 8, coffee in each hand. "Didn't figure you for an early riser," he said, handing one over. "Didn't figure I'd be back here either," Ruth said, "but I keep thinking about what Walter built this place into. 40 years, and it just sits here going gray." "Building's still sound," Pruitt said. "I checked with the county last month, out of habit. Roof's good. Wiring's old, but good." Ruth sipped the coffee, looking at the dusty window, the shelves inside still stocked with things nobody had touched. What would it cost to open it back up? Pruitt raised an eyebrow. "You serious? I've got $1.2 million sitting in a box with my name on it," Ruth said. "Man spent decades building that so somebody could use it right. I don't think he meant for it to just sit in a vault growing interest while I watch television." "Rough number, inventory and repairs both. Maybe 80,000, Pruitt said. "Less if you don't rush it. That's nothing against what's in that box." "No," Pruitt said. "It isn't." Ruth looked at the padlock a while longer. "Don't tell anybody yet. I want it decided before Denise hears about it and decides it's hers to have an opinion on." "Wouldn't dream of it," Pruitt said. Boss would have liked this, Ruth. I mean that. I know, Ruth said. That's why I'm doing it. They walked back toward Maine together, and Ruth felt something in her chest that hadn't been there in 6 weeks. Not quite happiness. Something steadier than that. By Thursday afternoon, word had reached Ruth a different way. Gary called, voice tight. The seller's on the lake house, he said. They called Denise this morning, wanted to know if we're still good for Friday. And what did she tell them? Ruth asked. She told them yes, Gary said. Ruth, she doesn't have $60,000. She doesn't have $6,000. I checked our accounts last night. We're down to $1,100 and half of that's earmarked for the truck payment. Where'd it all go, Gary? The lawyer, Gary said. Broward wanted a retainer for the will contest, $10,000 up front. She paid it out of what was left from your accounts before the freeze got denied. Ruth closed her eyes a second, standing on the cottage porch, the beagle asleep against her foot. She spent the last of it fighting a case a judge already called thin. She thought she'd win, Gary said. She still thinks she can win. Did you tell your lawyer about the earnest money yet? About getting released? This morning, Gary said. He's drafting a notice. Rescission based on misrepresentation. Says if the sellers push back, we might still owe something, but nowhere near $60,000. Nowhere near what Denise thinks she's protecting. What did she say when you told her? Gary was quiet a second. She didn't say anything, Ruth. She just looked at me like I'd switched sides on her. You didn't switch sides, Ruth said. You picked the truth. That's not a side, Gary. That's just where the ground is. Feels like a side when you're standing on it alone. You're not alone, Ruth said. You've got a mother who still answers the phone. Gary laughed, short and tired. Yeah, I noticed. Friday's sellers called back that evening according to what Gary told her the next morning over coffee at the cottage. They wanted their answer by noon. No extensions, no grace period, $60,000 or the house goes back on the market and the deposit's forfeit, plain as that. Denise, it turned out, had one more move left, and Ruth heard about it from Carol Ann before lunch. She filed something new, Carol Ann said over the phone, her voice clipped, like she'd read it twice already. An emergency petition asking the court to order partial disbursement from the estate, $60,000 specifically, citing hardship. Hardship, Ruth repeated. Her words, says she's facing imminent financial loss due to estate delays that weren't her fault. Ruth almost laughed, except nothing about it was funny. The delays she caused herself. Judge Andrade's clerk already flagged it for a same-day ruling, Carol Ann said. No hearing. Andrade's just going to read the filing and decide. I expect a denial by end of day, but I wanted you to hear it from me before Denise tries calling you first. She won't call me, Ruth said. She'll call Gary. Maybe, Carol Ann said. Either way, I'll let you know the second Andrade rules. Ruth hung up and sat on the porch step, the beagle's head heavy on her knee, and thought about Denise somewhere across town, waiting on a judge to hand her $60,000 out of an estate she'd spent 2 months trying to prove Ruth didn't deserve to keep. The ruling came at 3 that afternoon. Carol Ann read it to her over the phone, flat and quick. Denied, she said. Andrade wrote, and I'm quoting here, petitioners asserted hardship arises from her own contractual decisions made independent of and prior to any estate distribution. The court will not use estate assets to underwrite a private real estate transaction. She said all that? She said more, Carol Ann said. But that's the part that matters. Denise doesn't get the $60,000, Ruth. Not from the estate, not today, not before Friday. Ruth sat with that a moment, looking out at Coldwater Creek Road, at the beagle now sprawled flat in the shade like the day had already worn him out. Then Friday's going to be a hard day for her. I imagine so, Carol Ann said. I'll be at the bank tomorrow morning, either way. Pruitt tells me the county clerk's finishing the last piece of paperwork on the Box 114 assets, making everything official on record. If Denise wants to see numbers in black and white, she picked a good week to keep showing up at First Farmers Trust. She always did like proof, Ruth said. Guess she'll get some. That night, Ruth wrote in the ledger by lamplight, the way she'd started doing again most evenings, the way Walter used to. Not numbers this time, just a line under his old handwriting, small and careful. Store's getting its sign back up, Walter. Wanted you to know first. She closed the cover, brass corners catching lamplight, the loose panel long since repaired, flat and quiet, its secret already spent. The beagle sighed in his sleep by the door. Outside, the porch light stayed on, same as every night since she'd moved in, because some habits weren't worth breaking, even after the thing they used to guard against was gone. Friday morning came in warm and clear, cicadas already going before 8. Ruth dressed in the navy dress one more time and told herself it was the last time this month she'd need it. Pruitt picked her up at 9, quiet, the two of them driving into town, past the shuttered storefront on Depot Street, past the bank sign catching sun on Main, everybody in Briar Hollow moving through an ordinary day that Ruth suspected wasn't going to stay ordinary past noon. "You nervous?" Pruitt asked at a stoplight. "No," Ruth said. 6 weeks ago I might have been. Today I think I'm just ready to watch the last of it land." Pruitt nodded, easing the car forward when the light changed. "Boss used to say the truth doesn't rush. It just shows up exactly when it's supposed to." "He was right about most things," Ruth said. "Guess I should have written that one down too." Pruitt parked behind the bank and Ruth followed him in through the side door, past the tellers already opening their drawers for the day. Carol Ann was waiting by the vault, briefcase at her feet, a folder under one arm. "Morning," she said. "County clerk called ahead. Everything's ready to record. The CD's been converted to your name outright. Stock transfer's final too." "That fast?" Ruth asked. 40 years of paperwork done right the first time," Pruitt said. "Doesn't take long to finish it properly." They sat at a small table near the vault door. Carol Ann laid out 3 documents, each one thin, official, unremarkable to look at for what they were worth. Ruth signed where the tabs told her to sign. Ruth Ann Callahan, in careful cursive, same hand she'd used on every thank you note she'd ever written. "That's it," Carol Ann said, gathering the pages. "I'll walk these to the courthouse myself this afternoon. Deed and disbursement both go on record today." "What's the CD worth now exactly?" Ruth asked. "I never did hear the final number out loud." Pruitt pulled a printed statement from his folder and set it in front of her. $810,000 on the certificate, matured out. Stocks valued at $390 per the title company's assessment last week. Comes to $1,200,000 even, minus the appraisal fee, which the estate already covered. Ruth looked at the number a long moment. Denise called this a dollar's worth of old paper. "She was off some," Pruitt said. Carol Ann almost smiled. "Off by about $1,199,999, if we're being exact." "Let's be exact," Ruth said. "I think Walter would have liked that part best." They were still at the table when the side door opened and Denise walked in, sunglasses pushed up into her hair, a folder of her own clutched against her chest like it might still change something. She stopped short at the sight of the 3 of them together, papers spread out, Pruitt's tie loosened, the whole scene looking exactly like what it was. "What is this?" Denise said. "Recording the transfer," Carol Ann said, calm. "Nothing that concerns you. Everything about this estate concerns me." Denise's voice had an edge in it Ruth hadn't heard before, thin and stretched, like a wire pulled past what it was rated for. "Not anymore," Ruth said. "Court settled that Tuesday." Denise's eyes dropped to the statement still sitting on the table, the number printed plain in black ink. Ruth watched her read it twice. "That's not real," Denise said. "It's about as real as numbers get," Pruitt said. "Signed, dated, notarized 20 minutes ago." Denise's mouth opened and nothing came out for a second. Then, quieter, almost to herself. "You told me it wasn't worth anything." "No," Ruth said. "You told me that. Handed me that ledger like a paper plate and said, 'Keep it. It's not worth anything.' I just never got around to correcting you till now." The silence after that stretched longer than Ruth expected. Denise looked at the statement again, like staring might change the zeros. "The sellers called this morning," Denise said finally, voice flat now, all the fight gone out of it. "Noon deadline, 60,000 or the deposit's forfeit." She looked up. "You have it right there on that table." "I do," Ruth said, "and it's staying right there." "Ruth, please." The word came out cracked. Nothing like the woman who'd stood in a courtroom 3 days earlier calling Ruth incompetent to a judge. "It's family money. It should help family." "It is helping family," Ruth said. "Just not the way you had it planned." She folded her hands on the table. "You spent 3 months treating me like I was already gone. Denise, Like grief made me stupid instead of just sad. I don't owe you $60,000 for that. I don't owe you a dime. Gary's my husband. That makes me family too. Gary's my son, Ruth said. That's a different kind of family than the kind you married into on paper. One of those you keep by loving people right. The other you can lose by treating them wrong long enough. She looked at the folder still pressed to Denise's chest. What's that you're carrying? Denise's grip on it tightened, like she'd forgotten it was there. Nothing. A new filing. Doesn't matter now. Another petition? Carol Ann asked, professional interest sharpening her voice. It doesn't matter, Denise said again, and this time it sounded true. She looked at the clock above the teller windows. 9:40, 2 hours and 20 minutes left on a debt she couldn't undo. I need to call the sellers. You do that? Ruth said, not unkindly. Tell them the truth. Might go easier than you think. Denise turned for the door, folder still clutched tight, sunglasses sliding back down over eyes that looked for just a second like they might actually spill something. She stopped at the threshold. Did he know? She asked, not turning around. Walter. Did he know I'd do this? Is that why he hid it? Ruth thought about that honestly before she answered. I don't think Walter spent his last years planning around you, Denise. I think he just believed some things ought to stay quiet till they were needed. Turned out they were needed. Denise didn't answer that. She walked out into the parking lot, heels loud on the pavement, phone already at her ear before the door swung shut behind her. Pruitt exhaled slow. Well, Ruth agreed. Carol Ann started stacking the papers back into her folder. I should get these to the courthouse before lunch. Recorder's office closes the window at 4, and I'd rather this be done today, not Monday. Go on, Ruth said. I'll be here. Carol Ann left with a nod, briefcase swinging, and Pruitt walked Ruth back toward the lobby, past the same brass-railed counter where all this had started 6 weeks earlier, a cracked ledger and a key nobody knew to look for yet. You didn't gloat, Pruitt said, once they were alone by the window. Coulda gloated. Lord knows you earned it. Wasn't the point, Ruth said. Walter never gloated over a sale in his life. Didn't seem right to start now, spending his money. Boss would have been proud of that answer. He'd have been proud of the number, Ruth said. The answer's just me trying to keep up with him. Gary called at 11:40, right as Ruth was finishing a cup of coffee in the bank's little waiting area. The beagle's leash looped over her wrist from the walk-in. She'd started bringing him everywhere lately. Pruitt hadn't minded once. She called the sellers, Gary said, before Ruth even said hello, told them the truth. Tried to walk it back to the deposit, asked for an extension. They give her one? No. Gary's voice was tired, rung thin. They said no extensions. That was the deal from the start. Deposits forfeit. House goes back on the market this afternoon. $60,000, Ruth said. Gone. Just like that. Just like that, Gary said. She's sitting in the car right now, hasn't said a word in 10 minutes. How are you doing, Gary? A long pause on the line. Honestly, relieved, which feels like a terrible thing to say about my own wife losing $60,000. It's not terrible, Ruth said. It's just true. Sometimes those are the same thing. She watched the beagle stretch out flat on the cool tile by her feet. You'll get through today. Might be a quiet house tonight, but you'll get through it. Are you at the bank? Recording paperwork, Ruth said. Making it all official, so nobody can come back and ask twice. Mom, Gary's voice caught a little. I'm sorry, for all of it, for not seeing what she was doing until it was already done. I know, Ruth said. I believe you. That's a start, Gary. Not the whole road, but a start. She hung up and looked out the bank window at Main Street, cars easing past in the noon light, the courthouse just visible 2 blocks down where Carol Ann was likely walking papers through a recorder's window right about now, making a fortune permanent on a page. Pruitt came and sat beside her. 2 coffees again, like Tuesday morning had become a habit neither one of them had planned. Deeds recorded, he said, checking his phone. Carol Ann just texted. County stamped it 11 minutes ago. So it's done, Ruth said. All of it, Pruitt said. The legal part anyway. Ruth looked down at the beagle, snoring soft against her shoe, then out at Depot Street just past the bank's parking lot, the shuttered storefront still waiting under its faded green sign. There's one part left, she said, and it isn't legal. It's just right. Ruth didn't go straight home. She walked Pruitt out to the parking lot, the beagle trotting stiff-legged beside her, and pointed down Main toward Depot Street. "Walk with me," she said. "Won't take long." Pruitt checked his watch, then put it away. "Boss used to say the bank could wait 10 minutes. Guess I can too." They crossed at the light, past the diner, past the old 5 and dime turned insurance office, until Depot Street opened up in front of them, quiet in the noon sun. Callahan's Hardware sat where it always had, windows soaped over, the faded green sign hanging crooked on one bolt. Ruth stopped on the sidewalk and looked at it a long moment. 41 years, she said. "Walter opened that door in 1968, and I never once thought it'd go dark." 6 weeks, Pruitt said. "That's all it's been dark. Feels longer." She walked up to the glass and cupped her hands against it, peering through the soap streaks at the empty shelves, the dust on the counter where Walter used to ring up nails by the pound. The beagle sat on the sidewalk and waited, patient as he'd always been. "I want to open it back up," Ruth said. Pruitt didn't answer right away. "You've got the money now. You could do about anything you want." "I don't want a lake house," Ruth said. "I don't want stock in something I've never seen. I want that door unlocked and that sign fixed and somebody standing behind that counter who remembers how to cut a key by hand. You thinking, Gary?" "Thinking me some days," Ruth said. "Thinking Gary the rest. He worked that counter every summer till he was 20. Never forgot how." Pruitt smiled, the first easy smile she'd seen on him in weeks. "Boss taught him same as he taught me. I want a new sign," Ruth said. "Not Callahan's Hardware. Something else." "What did you have in mind?" "Walter's General Store," Ruth said. "Simple as that. Big enough to read from the street." Pruitt looked at the crooked green sign a moment, then back at her. "I know a fellow does signs over in Corbin. Can have one up in 10 days if you want it done right." 10 days, Ruth said. "Let's find out what right costs." The sign, it turned out, cost $1,800, hand-painted, cedar backing, gold leaf on the lettering. Ruth wrote the check herself, right there in the sign shop, and didn't blink once. "You want it lit at night?" the sign painter asked, an older man with paint under his nails and reading glasses pushed up on his head. "Yes," Ruth said, "every night. Somebody left a porch light on for me once. Feels only right to pass it along." Getting the store itself ready took longer. Ruth hired a cleaning crew out of Somerset, $600 for 2 days of scrubbing 40 years of dust off shelves that hadn't seen a rag since Walter's last week on his feet. She hired an electrician to check the wiring, 400 more, and a young man named Dale Pruitt, Earl's nephew, to restock what could be salvaged and order fresh inventory for what couldn't. Gary showed up the second morning, sleeves rolled, a crowbar in one hand for the boarded back window. "Denise doesn't know I'm here," he said, before Ruth could ask. "Didn't feel like a conversation I wanted to have before I'd already decided." "You don't need her permission to help your daddy's store," Ruth said. "Feels like everything needs her permission lately." Gary set the crowbar down and looked around the dim store, sunlight cutting through gaps in the soaped glass. "Feels different in here already. Lighter. It's just dust moving," Ruth said. "But I know what you mean." They worked through the morning mostly quiet. Gary prying boards loose out back, Ruth wiping down the old register with a soft cloth, the beagle asleep in a patch of sun by the door like he'd never left. Around 11, Gary straightened up, wiped his forehead, and said what Ruth figured he'd been working up to say all morning. "She's staying with her sister in Somerset for now," he said. "Denise, we're not divorced, not talking about that yet, just needed some room." "That's not a bad thing," Ruth said. "Room's not the same as gone." She said something before she left. Gary's voice went careful. Said she still thinks she did right by us. Said she was just trying to build us a future. Ruth set the cloth down. "Did you believe her?" "I believe she believes it," Gary said. "Doesn't make it true." "No," Ruth said. "It doesn't. Will you ever forgive her?" Ruth thought about that honestly, the way she'd learned to think about most things these past 6 weeks, weighing it before she spoke instead of after. "I don't know yet," she said. "I can forgive the fear in her. I understand fear. I lived plenty of years watching your daddy worry over the store, worry over the mortgage, worry over things that never came due. Fear makes people grab. I understand grabbing." She picked the cloth back up. "I don't forgive the lying yet. Might take longer for that part. Might take her actually saying, sorry, instead of saying she meant well." Gary nodded slow, like that was fairer than he'd expected. "That's fair." "It's not a door I've shut," Ruth said. "It's just not one I've opened either." He went back to the boards after that, and Ruth went back to the counter, and around noon a woman Ruth didn't recognize came in through the propped front door, a folded 20 in her hand. "I heard you were reopening," the woman said. "I used to buy nails here for my husband's shop years back. Wanted to leave something toward it, if that's allowed." Ruth looked at the 20, then at the woman's face, kind and a little shy about the offering. "You don't have to do that," Ruth said. "I want to," the woman said. "This town's better with that door open. Always has been." Ruth took the 20 and folded it into the register drawer, empty except for that single bill, and thought that was as good a way as any to start a cash drawer back up. "What's your name?" Ruth asked. "Loretta," the woman said. "Loretta Combs." "Thank you, Loretta," Ruth said. "First dollar back in this store in 6 weeks. Second dollar, really. Guess I ought to write that down somewhere." She did that night, back at the cottage, the ledger open under lamplight. Not Walter's old columns this time, just a fresh page. Store reopening. Loretta Combs, $20. First customer in 6 weeks. Wanted nothing back but the door open. She looked at that line a moment, then added one more beneath it, smaller. Some debts don't ask to be repaid, you repay them anyway. The beagle shifted against her foot, and outside the cottage window, Depot Street sat 2 miles off in the dark, waiting on its new sign, gold leaf catching whatever light came its way once Dale finished wiring the bulbs behind the lettering. Ruth closed the ledger, careful with the brass corners, and sat a while longer with her tea going cold, thinking that 40 years from now somebody else might open this same book and find her handwriting the way she'd found Walter's, and wonder what it had cost her to write it plain. 10 days came faster than Ruth expected, the way busy days always did. Dale finished the shelves. The electricians signed off on the wiring. The sign went up on a Thursday morning, cedar and gold leaf catching sun off Main Street traffic, and by Friday Ruth had a date circled on the calendar Carol Ann had given her, red ink, underlined twice. Saturday, 9 in the morning, ribbon and all. Saturday morning came up gray at first, low clouds sitting over Briar Hollow like they hadn't decided yet, and Ruth stood at her cottage window with coffee going cold in her hand, watching the sky same as she used to watch Walter check it before opening the store. By 8, the clouds had broken. By 8:30, cars were already easing into the gravel lot beside Depot Street, more than Ruth expected for a hardware store nobody thought would open again. Gary picked her up at 8:45, the beagle already loaded in the back seat, like he understood the day mattered. "You nervous?" Gary asked, pulling onto Main. "Some," Ruth said. "Your daddy used to say opening day was worse than closing day. Closing day, you already know how it went." "She called this morning," Gary said, eyes on the road. "Denise. Wanted to know if I was going." Ruth waited. "I told her yes," Gary said. "Told her I hoped she'd think about coming too. Someday." "Not today." "What did she say?" "Said she wasn't ready to stand on that street yet." Gary's jaw worked a moment. "I think that's the most honest thing she's said in 6 weeks." "That's a start," Ruth said again, same words she'd given him before, and meant them a little more this time. Depot Street was near full by 9, folks lined along both sides of the sidewalk. Some Ruth knew by name, and some she only half remembered from 40 years of ringing up nails and paint and garden hose. Earl Pruitt stood by the door already, tie straight, a pair of long-handled scissors in a box tucked under one arm, like he'd been guarding it all week. "Morning, Mrs. Callahan," he said. "Same as always. Morning, Earl." She looked up at the sign, gold letters catching the sun now that the clouds had cleared. "Walter's General Store. Sign's prettier in daylight than I figured. Told you the man in Corbett knew his business." Loretta Combs was near the front of the crowd, a casserole dish balanced on one arm like she'd come from church instead of home. "Brought something for after," she said. "Figured a reopening ought to have food." "You didn't have to do that," Ruth said. "Same thing you said about the $20, Loretta said, smiling. "I didn't have to do that either." Dale Pruitt stood just inside the propped door, apron already on, a fresh ledger book laid open on the counter behind him, blank pages waiting. Ruth had bought it herself, cloth-bound, nothing fancy, the kind of book that could hold 40 more years if somebody kept after it. "First entry's yours to write," Ruth told him. "Opening day, whatever you want to say about it." Dale looked pleased and a little nervous, like she'd handed him something heavier than a pen. A local reporter Ruth didn't know, young, a notepad instead of a phone, came up while she waited by the door. "Mrs. Callahan, can I ask you something for the paper?" "You can ask. Folks are saying there was some money involved. An inheritance nobody knew about. Is that why the store's reopening?" Ruth considered how to answer that plain, the way she'd learned to answer most things since the ledger first cracked open on a bank counter. "There was money," she said. "There's always money in these stories, one way or another. But the store's reopening because my husband built it with his hands, and I wasn't about to let it stay dark. The money just paid for new shelves. How much did it cost, all told?" "Reopening?" "Cleaning crew $600, Ruth said. "Electrician $400, sign $1,800. Inventory a good deal more than that, but Dale's got the receipts if the paper wants them." She smiled a little. "I kept everyone. Habit I picked up from my husband." The reporter wrote fast, then asked the question Ruth had been waiting on since she agreed to the interview. "And is it true the whole estate almost went to a lake house instead?" "That's true," Ruth said. $60,000 gone to a deposit that didn't come back. That's not really this store's business, though. This store's business is nails and rope and good advice, same as it always was." She turned before he could ask another one and found Pruitt at her elbow with the scissors box open, the ribbon already strung across the doorframe, red against the cedar and gold of the new sign. "Whenever you're ready," Pruitt said. "Boss would have made you wait till exactly 9. Never opened early or late a day in his life." Ruth checked her watch. 2 minutes to 9. "Then we'll wait," she said. Wouldn't feel right doing it his way different. Gary stood beside her now, the beagle sitting between them on a leash gone slack, tail thumping slow against the sidewalk like he already knew something good was coming. Ruth reached down and scratched behind his ears, the same worn spot Walter used to scratch, and the dog leaned into her hand. "You want to say anything before you cut it?" Pruitt asked. "Crowd's waiting." Ruth looked down Depot Street at faces she'd known through decades of Christmas mornings and funeral casseroles and small kindnesses that never asked for a thing back. She looked at the new sign, gold letters bright, and thought about a green one just like it that used to hang crooked on one bolt for longer than anybody should have let it. "Maybe a little something," she said. "Nothing long. Your daddy never liked long speeches either." She held the scissors loose in one hand and turned to face the street, the ribbon still uncut, the crowd quieting the way a crowd does when it senses the moment's about to arrive. Denise Callahan stood at the back of the crowd, arms crossed, sunglasses pushed up into her hair. Nobody had told Ruth she was coming. Nobody needed to. Ruth saw her the second she looked up from the scissors, past Gary's shoulder, past Earl Pruitt's tie. Denise wasn't smiling. She wasn't scowling either. She just stood there, like a woman checking on an investment she wasn't sure she still owned a piece of. Gary followed Ruth's eyes and went stiff. "She said she wasn't ready," he said, low. "Guess she changed her mind," Ruth said. "That happens." Pruitt leaned in close enough that only Ruth could hear him. "You want me to ask her to step back? Crowd's here for you, not for trouble." "No," Ruth said. "Let her stand there. She can watch same as anybody." The reporter's pencil had gone still, sensing something the notepad hadn't caught yet. Ruth ignored him and looked instead at the ribbon, red against the gold lettering, and then at the faces lined up on both sides of Depot Street, waiting on her the way they used to wait on Walter to flip the sign from closed to open, rain or shine, 40 years running. "My husband used to say a store's not really open till somebody buys something," Ruth said, loud enough to carry. "So I'm not going to make a speech. I'm just going to cut this ribbon, and then I want every one of you to come on in and buy a bag of nails you don't need." A laugh went through the crowd, easy and warm. 9 o'clock, Pruitt said, checking his watch one more time. Right on the nose. Ruth raised the scissors. The blades caught the sun same as the gold letters overhead, and for half a second she thought of Walter standing in that same doorway, keys jingling, coffee in a chipped mug, 40 years of mornings just like this one stacked up behind her like plates in a cupboard. She cut the ribbon. It fell in 2 clean pieces onto the sidewalk, and the crowd clapped, some of them cheering outright, Loretta Combs loudest of all, with her casserole dish still balanced on one arm. Gary let out a breath Ruth hadn't realized he'd been holding. The beagle barked once, sharp and pleased with himself, like he'd been the one to do the cutting. Ruth looked past all of it, straight at Denise. Denise didn't clap. She didn't move at all for a moment. Then she stepped forward, slow, through the crowd that parted for her, the way crowds do for someone they're not sure how to feel about. "Ruth," she said, once she'd reached the front. "Can we talk? Just a minute." The street had gone a little quieter around them. People still smiling but watching now too, the way people do when a second conversation starts under the first one. "You can talk," Ruth said. "I'm listening." Denise glanced at the sign overhead, the fresh cedar, the gold leaf, and something moved across her face that Ruth couldn't quite name. Not envy exactly. Something closer to arithmetic. "I heard about the store," Denise said. "I heard you put a lot into it." "I put what it needed," Ruth said. "The lake house is gone," Denise said. "Officially. Papers went through Thursday. We lost the deposit, and the bank's coming after the rest of the loan since the closing fell apart." Her voice caught, just slightly. "I'm not saying that so you'll feel sorry for me." "I don't feel sorry for you," Ruth said. Plain, not unkind. "I feel sorry it took this to get you standing on this sidewalk." Denise looked down at the two cut pieces of ribbon on the concrete. "I told everyone I built us a future," she said. "I keep hearing myself say it. Gary told me you heard it too." "I did. I don't know how to take it back." "You don't take back a thing like that," Ruth said. "You just stop saying it, and you start doing something true instead." Denise's eyes went wet, and she blinked hard against it, the way a woman does in front of a crowd she doesn't want watching her cry. "I don't have anything to offer," she said. "Not money. Not right now. Maybe not ever the way things stand." Ruth studied her a moment. The woman who'd once set a cracked ledger in her lap and called it worthless. The woman who'd sold a truck and a house and 40 years of furniture in 6 days flat. She didn't feel forgiveness rise up in her. Not yet. Not the whole warm flood of it. But she felt something small and definite. A single stone set down instead of thrown. "You could sweep a floor," Ruth said. Denise blinked. "What?" "Dale's going to need help back there once the crowd clears," Ruth said. "Stocking shelves. Running the register on Saturdays, when Gary's got other things. It doesn't pay much. Store's barely breaking even its first month, you understand. But it's honest work, and it's here, and it's a place to start being someone instead of just saying you are." "You'd let me work in Walter's store," Denise said, like she couldn't quite believe the shape of the sentence. "I'd let you earn your way into this family again," Ruth said. "One shift at a time. No shortcuts. No lake houses. Just the counter and the register and showing up when you say you will." Denise looked at Gary, who hadn't said a word through any of it, just watched, his jaw working the way it did when he was holding something back. He gave her the smallest nod, not quite forgiveness either, but not nothing. "I'll be here Monday," Denise said. "If that's all right." "Monday's fine," Ruth said. "Store opens at 8. Don't be late. Your father-in-law never was." Denise nodded again, wiped under one eye quick with the back of her hand, and stepped back into the crowd, smaller somehow than she'd looked walking up, though nothing about her had actually shrunk. Pruitt exhaled beside Ruth, long and slow. "That's more grace than I'd have given her." "It's not grace," Ruth said. "It's a broom and a Monday. Grace is a bigger word than that. We'll see if she earns it." The crowd had already started drifting toward the prop door, drawn by Loretta's casserole and the smell of fresh paint and cedar. Dale stood behind the counter, pen poised over the new ledger, waiting on somebody to make the first sale so he'd have something to write down. Ruth walked in behind the others, the beagle trotting at her heel, and stopped at the counter where Dale stood ready. "Go on," she told him. "Write it down. Grand opening, 9 sharp. More folks on Depot Street than I've seen since the 4th of July parade." Dale wrote it, careful, the way she'd taught him to write anything that mattered. Grand opening, 9 o'clock. Whole town came. Gary came up beside her, hands in his pockets, watching the crowd fill the aisles his father used to walk with a box cutter tucked behind one ear. "You all right?" Ruth asked him. "I think so," Gary said. "Feels strange. Good strange." "That's usually how the right thing feels at first," Ruth said. "Strange until it doesn't." She looked around the store one more time, at the shelves Dale had stocked, at the register humming quiet under fluorescent light, at Loretta setting her casserole down on a folding table somebody had dragged in from the back room, Outside, the gold letters on the new sign caught the noon sun square on, bright enough to read from clear across Main Street. Walter's General Store. Ruth thought about the ledger sitting back at the cottage, cloth corners worn soft from 40 years of handling. Walter's cramped handwriting still legible on that very first page. Count every page, Ruthie. The last one's worth more than the rest. She understood now he hadn't just meant the money. He'd meant the whole of it, every entry, every quiet decision made at a kitchen table after the store had closed for the night, every dollar set aside where nobody thought to look. The last page of a life doesn't total up in numbers alone. It totals up in what gets left standing after you're gone. The store was standing. That was the sum that mattered. She reached down and scratched the beagle's ears one more time, and he leaned into her hand the way he always had, patient, forgiving, asking for nothing but a little bit of kindness passed along. "Come on," Ruth said to him, soft. "Let's go see if anybody needs help finding the right size nail." Monday morning came up clear. No clouds this time. Ruth unlocked the front door at 7:45, same as she'd done every day since the reopening, and found Denise already waiting on the sidewalk, arms crossed against the cold, a paper cup of gas station coffee in one hand. "You're early," Ruth said. "Didn't want to be late on my first day." Denise held up the coffee like proof of something, figured showing up counted for more than looking good doing it. Ruth unlocked the door and held it open. "Then get in here. Dale will show you the register." Dale Pruitt met her at the counter with a look Ruth couldn't quite read, somewhere between wary and willing to be surprised. He walked Denise through the drawer, the pricing book, the way Walter used to round down on anything under $1 rather than deal with pennies. Denise wrote it all down in a little spiral notebook she'd brought from her purse. Quick, careful notes, the kind of attention Ruth hadn't seen out of her in longer than she could remember. By 9, the first customer of the day came through the door. Old Mr. Tolliver, looking for 3/4-inch copper fittings, the same thing he bought every spring for a leak that never quite got fixed right. "Help you find something?" Denise asked him, before Dale could even step over. "Copper fittings," Tolliver said, squinting at her like he was trying to place her. "You're Gary's wife." "I am," Denise said. Her voice didn't waver on it. "Fittings are aisle 3, left side, bottom shelf. I can walk you back if you want." She did. Ruth watched from behind the counter as Denise led him down the aisle, pointed out the right size, even mentioned the washer he'd need to keep it from leaking again. Small thing, ordinary thing. But Ruth felt something loosen in her chest watching it, some knot she hadn't known was still pulled tight. "She's not bad at this," Dale said quietly, once Denise was out of earshot. "Give her time," Ruth said. "First day." Tolliver bought his fittings, paid Denise at the register without complaint, and left with a nod that Ruth read as approval, quiet as it was. Gary came by at lunch, stood in the doorway a minute before Denise noticed him. When she did, she didn't run to him, didn't make a show of it. She just lifted one hand, small wave, and went back to stocking a shelf of hinges. "She's doing all right?" Gary asked Ruth. "She showed up on time and she's still here at noon," Ruth said. "That's more than I expected and better than nothing. That's not much of an endorsement." "It's an honest one," Ruth said. "Best kind I've got to give her right now." Gary watched his wife a moment longer, then nodded, like he'd decided something and wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. He left without going to her, and Ruth understood that too. Some things mend slow. Nobody needed to rush it. Wednesday afternoon, the bell over the door rang and Earl Pruitt walked in, tie loosened, looking like a man who'd left the bank in the middle of something. "Got a minute?" he asked Ruth. "For you, always." She waved him toward the back counter, away from customers. "I made some changes at First Farmers," Pruitt said, "since your ledger came through my window." "What kind of changes?" "Any account holder over 70, any estate matter that touches a joint account gets flagged now. Second signature required before a large withdrawal clears. And nobody at my bank calls an old ledger or a strongbox worthless without a manager walking it through first." He said it plain, no pride in his voice, just fact. Should have had that policy years ago. Didn't think of it till I watched what almost happened to you. Ruth studied him. "That's not a small thing to change, Earl. Wasn't a small thing that happened to you," he said. "Figured the bank owed you that much." Before Ruth could answer, the bell rang again, and an older woman came through the door. thin coat, a cane in one hand, a bank envelope clutched in the other like she wasn't sure who to trust with it. "Mrs. Yoder," Pruitt said, surprised. "What brings you down to Depot Street?" "Ruth Callahan," the woman said, looking between them. "Somebody told me you'd know what an old ledger's worth. Mine's got some papers in the back I never showed anybody. My daughter says it's just clutter." She held the envelope out like it was heavier than paper had any right to be. "But my husband wrote something on the first page before he passed. Said to count every page." Ruth felt the floor tilt slightly under her, some old ache and some old comfort arriving together. "Sit down, Mrs. Yoder," she said. "Let's have a look." Pruitt was already reaching for his phone. "I'll get somebody to open the vault first thing tomorrow. Whatever's in there, we won't be guessing at its worth from a folding chair." Ruth pulled out a stool for the woman, poured her a cup of coffee from the pot Dale kept going behind the counter, and sat with her while she opened the envelope, slow, careful, the way Ruth herself had once sat with a cracked leather ledger and no idea yet what it was hiding. Whatever was in Mrs. Yoder's pages, somebody was going to look at it properly this time. Nobody would call it scrap paper and walk away with the truck. Denise came by with a broom in hand, saw the woman at the counter, and without being asked, brought her a chair with better back support from the office. She didn't say anything grand about it, she just set it down, nodded once, and went back to sweeping. Ruth watched her do it, and thought that maybe some people learn slow, but they do learn if you give them a broom and a Monday and let them earn it one shift at a time. That evening, after the doors were locked and Dale had gone home, Ruth sat alone at the counter with the old ledger open in front of her, the loose panel long since repaired, the brass key sitting in a small dish beside the register where she kept it now, more charm than tool. She ran one thumb along Walter's handwriting on the first page. Faded ink, steady hand. Outside, the gold letters on the sign held the last of the evening light. Ruth closed the ledger, turned off the lamp, and locked the door behind her, the beagle trotting ahead of her down the sidewalk toward home.